The collapse of Roman authority in Hispania began not with a single catastrophic event, but through a gradual erosion that unfolded over several decades in the early 5th century. By 409, the western reaches of the Roman Empire had become increasingly unable to maintain effective control over its distant provinces, and Hispania found itself at the mercy of migrating Germanic tribes who had crossed the Pyrenees in search of new lands to settle. The Vandals, Alans and Suebi were the first to establish themselves on Iberian soil, carving out territories through a combination of negotiation and force. The Vandals claimed the southern regions that would later bear their name as Vandalusia, while the Suebi settled in the northwestern territories of Gallaecia. The Alans occupied the central plateau regions, though their presence would prove less enduring than that of their Germanic contemporaries. These early settlements created a patchwork of competing authorities across the peninsula, with Roman administrative structures persisting in some areas while completely dissolving in others. The arrival of the Visigoths fundamentally altered this dynamic. Unlike the earlier Germanic settlers, the Visigoths entered Hispania as foederati, allied troops officially sanctioned by Rome to act on behalf of imperial interests. Their initial mandate was to restore Roman order by subduing the other Germanic tribes, a task they pursued with considerable success. Under the leadership of kings like Wallia, the Visigoths systematically defeated the Vandals and Alans, driving the former toward North Africa and virtually eliminating the latter as a political force. The Visigothic settlement process differed markedly from the more chaotic migrations of other Germanic peoples. Rather than simply seizing territory through conquest, the Visigoths implemented a sophisticated system of hospitality that allowed them to integrate with existing Roman structures while maintaining their distinct identity. Under this arrangement, Visigothic warriors received portions of Roman estates, typically 1/3 of the productive land, while Roman proprietors retained the remainder. This system, known as the tertia, created a framework for coexistence that would persist for generations. The establishment of Toledo as the Visigothic capital around 550 marked a crucial turning point in the kingdom's development. The city's central location provided strategic advantages for controlling the entire peninsula, while its existing Roman infrastructure offered the administrative capabilities necessary for governing a complex, ethnically diverse population. The royal palace complex that emerged in Toledo became the seat of a sophisticated court culture that blended Germanic traditions with Roman administrative practices and increasingly influential Christian religious elements. Visigothic kingship operated according to elective rather than hereditary principles, a tradition that would prove both a source of strength and chronic instability throughout the kingdom's existence. The nobility possessed the right to select rulers from among qualified candidates, typically members of prominent Gothic families who had demonstrated military prowess and political acumen. This system theoretically ensured that only capable leaders would ascend to the throne, but in practice it generated constant competition and intrigue among ambitious nobles seeking to advance their own candidates. The religious transformation of the Visigothic kingdom represented one of the most significant developments of the 6th century. The Visigoths had originally embraced Arian Christianity, a theological position that denied the full divinity of Christ and had been condemned as heretical by the Roman Catholic Church. This religious divide created persistent tensions between the Visigothic ruling class and their predominantly Catholic Roman subjects, undermining the kingdom's internal cohesion and complicating relationships with other Christian powers. King Ricardo's conversion to Catholicism in 587 fundamentally altered the kingdom's religious and political landscape. The conversion was not merely a personal decision, but a calculated political move designed to unite his diverse subjects under a common religious framework. The Third Council of Toledo in 589 formally ratified this transformation, with Ricard publicly renouncing Arianism and embracing Catholic orthodoxy alongside numerous Visigothic nobles and bishops. The political implications of this religious conversion extended far beyond matters of theology. Catholic Christianity provided a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic divisions between Goths and Romans, creating a shared identity based on religious rather than tribal affiliation. The conversion also eliminated a major source of internal dissent, as Catholic Romans could no longer view their Visigothic rulers as religious outsiders imposing an alien faith. The integration of Catholic Christianity into Visigothic governance manifested most clearly in the institution of church councils. These assemblies, which met regularly in Toledo, combined ecclesiastical and secular authority in unprecedented ways. Bishops and nobles deliberated together on matters ranging from theological doctrine to civil legislation, creating a unique form of government that historians have termed conciliar monarchy. The council's decisions carried the force of royal law, while their proceedings were recorded in detailed acta that provide invaluable insights into Visigothic political culture. The development of Visigothic legal traditions represented another crucial aspect of the kingdom's institutional evolution. The earliest Germanic law codes had been primarily oral traditions that governed relationships within tribal communities, but the complexities of ruling a large, diverse kingdom demanded more sophisticated legal instruments. The Codex Eurasianus, promulgated around 475 under King Euric, represented the first systematic attempt to codify Visigothic law in written form. This early legal code addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between Gothic and Roman legal traditions. Rather than simply imposing Germanic customs on Roman subjects, the Visigoths developed a dual legal system that allowed different ethnic groups to be governed according to their ancestral laws. Goths were subject to Germanic legal principles emphasizing personal honor and collective responsibility, while Romans continued to be governed by modified versions of Roman civil law. The limitations of this dual system became increasingly apparent as intermarriage and cultural assimilation blurred ethnic boundaries. The distinction between Goth and Roman grew less meaningful with each generation, creating confusion about which legal principles should apply in specific cases. King Chindaswinthe began addressing these problems in the mid-7th century by commissioning a comprehensive revision of the kingdom's legal framework. The resulting Liber Judiciorum, completed under King Reconquista around 654, represented one of the most sophisticated legal achievements of early medieval Europe. This comprehensive code abandoned the ethnic distinctions of earlier legislation, establishing a unified legal system that applied equally to all subjects regardless of their ancestral origins. The code's 12 books addressed everything from constitutional principles and criminal law to commercial regulations and family relationships. The Liber Judiciorum's influence extended far beyond the Visigothic kingdom's political boundaries. Its systematic organisation and comprehensive scope made it a model for legal development throughout medieval Europe. The code's principles would later influence the legal traditions of the Christian kingdoms that emerged during the Reconquest, while its specific provisions continued to be cited in Iberian courts for centuries after the Visigothic kingdom's collapse. The code's treatment of royal authority reflected the complex balance of power that characterised Visigothic governance. While affirming the king's supreme position within the political hierarchy, the Liber Judiciorum also established clear limitations on royal power. The nobility retained significant rights and privileges, including their traditional role in royal elections and their immunity from certain forms of royal punishment. These provisions reflected the contractual nature of Visigothic kingship, which was based on mutual obligations between rulers and subjects rather than absolute monarchical authority. Despite these institutional achievements, the Visigothic kingdom struggled with chronic political instability that would ultimately prove fatal. The elective nature of kingship, while theoretically ensuring competent leadership, created constant opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge royal authority. Succession crises became increasingly frequent and violent, with rival claimants often resorting to civil war to press their claims. The reign of King Wamba, 672-680, illustrated both the potential strengths and inherent weaknesses of the Visigothic system. Wamba demonstrated considerable military skill in suppressing rebellions and defending the kingdom's borders, while his administrative reforms strengthened royal authority and improved the kingdom's defensive capabilities. However, his eventual deposition through a palace conspiracy revealed the fragility of even successful Visigothic rulers when faced with determined noble opposition. The kingdom's military organisation reflected these internal tensions. The Visigothic army combined traditional Germanic warrior bands with Roman-influenced professional units, creating a force that was potentially formidable but often unreliable. Noble contingents owed personal loyalty to their immediate commanders rather than the crown, making it difficult for kings to maintain unified command during extended campaigns. This fragmentation of military authority would prove particularly problematic when the kingdom faced external threats requiring coordinated responses. The economic foundations of Visigothic power also showed signs of strain by the late 7th century. The kingdom's wealth depended heavily on agricultural production and tribute from conquered territories, both of which were vulnerable to external disruption. The loss of Mediterranean territories to Byzantine reconquest reduced the kingdom's resources, while increasing pressure from Frankish expansion in the north forced expensive defensive measures that strained royal finances. The reign of King Egica, 687–702, marked the beginning of the kingdom's final crisis period. Egica's attempts to strengthen royal authority through administrative centralisation and military reform provoked widespread noble resistance, leading to a series of rebellions that weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities. His decision to associate his son Witiza as co-ruler represented an attempt to ensure dynastic succession, but this innovation contradicted established Visigothic traditions and generated additional opposition. The circumstances surrounding Witiza's death and Roderick's subsequent accession to the throne in 710 remain historically controversial, but the political crisis they precipitated was undeniable. Witiza's supporters, led by prominent nobles like Count Julian of Ceuta, refused to accept Roderick's legitimacy and began seeking external allies to support their cause. This internal division would prove catastrophic when Muslim forces began probing the kingdom's southern defences. The Visigothic kingdom's institutional achievements, its sophisticated legal codes, its integration of religious and secular authority, its administrative innovations, could not overcome the fundamental political instability that plagued its final decades. The elective monarchy that had once been a source of strength became a fatal weakness when faced with external threats requiring unified leadership and coordinated response. The political turmoil that had consumed the Visigothic kingdom in its final years created precisely the conditions that Muslim commanders across the Strait of Gibraltar had been monitoring with keen interest. The Umayyad Caliphate's expansion across North Africa had reached the Atlantic coast by 708, bringing Islamic forces to within sight of the Iberian Peninsula. The strategic importance of controlling the strait was immediately apparent to Muslim military leaders, who recognised that possession of both shores would secure their North African conquests while opening new territories for expansion. The initial Muslim reconnaissance of Iberian defences began in 710 under the direction of Tarif ibn Malik, who led a small force across the strait to probe Visigothic coastal fortifications. These preliminary raids revealed the kingdom's military weakness and internal divisions, information that was quickly relayed to Musa ibn Nusayr, the Umayyad governor of Ifriqiya. Musa's strategic assessment concluded that the Visigothic kingdom presented an opportunity for rapid conquest that could be achieved with relatively modest forces if properly coordinated with internal opposition to King Roderick. The selection of Tariq ibn Ziyad to lead the main invasion force reflected careful consideration of the campaign's requirements. Tariq commanded a mixed force of Arab cavalry and Berber infantry that had proven effective in North African campaigns, while his personal reputation for tactical flexibility made him well suited for operations in unfamiliar territory. The invasion force that assembled at Tangier in early 711 numbered approximately 7,000 men, a relatively small army by contemporary standards, but one that was disciplined, experienced, and highly motivated by the prospect of conquest. The crossing itself took place in April 711, with Muslim forces landing at the rocky promontory that would subsequently bear Tariq's name as Jabal Tariq, or Gibraltar. The landing site was chosen for its defensive advantages rather than its proximity to major population centres. The towering limestone cliffs provided natural fortification against counterattack, while the narrow beach allowed for controlled disembarkation of troops and supplies. Tariq's first priority was establishing a secure base of operations from which his forces could launch systematic attacks on Visigothic positions throughout southern Hispania. The initial phase of the campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of Muslim tactical doctrine when applied against Visigothic defensive strategies. Rather than attempting to storm heavily fortified positions, Muslim commanders employed rapid cavalry movements to bypass strongpoints and strike at communications networks linking Visigothic garrisons. This approach exploited the kingdom's fundamental weakness in coordinating responses across its extensive territory, as isolated commanders were unable to determine whether attacks on their positions represented local raids or components of a larger strategic offensive. King Roderick's response to the invasion revealed the extent to which political divisions had compromised the kingdom's military effectiveness. The king was campaigning against Basque rebels in the north when news of the Muslim landing reached Toledo, forcing him to abandon operations against a familiar enemy to confront an unknown threat in the south. The time required to recall scattered forces and organise a coordinated response provided Muslim commanders with crucial weeks to consolidate their positions and gather intelligence about Visigothic military capabilities. The assembly of the Visigothic army that would confront Tariq's forces represented both the kingdom's remaining military potential and its fatal internal contradictions. Roderick managed to gather approximately 25,000 troops, a force that significantly outnumbered the Muslim invaders and should theoretically have possessed decisive advantages in any direct confrontation. However, this numerical superiority was compromised by the questionable loyalty of contingents commanded by nobles who disputed Roderick's legitimacy, particularly those associated with the supporters of the deceased King Witiza. The Battle of Guadalete, fought in July 711 near the Barbate River, became the decisive engagement that determined the fate of Visigothic Hispania. The battlefield itself was a rolling plain that favoured cavalry operations, giving both sides opportunities to employ their mounted forces effectively. Roderick positioned his army in traditional formation, with heavy infantry at the centre and cavalry on the wings, a deployment that had proven successful in previous campaigns against Frankish and Byzantine opponents. Tariq's tactical approach reflected the military innovations that had enabled Muslim forces to achieve rapid conquests across vast territories. Rather than accepting a static confrontation, Muslim commanders employed fluid cavalry tactics designed to disrupt enemy formations through repeated charges and withdrawals. Berberite cavalry harassed Visigothic positions with archery and javelin attacks, while Arab heavy cavalry concentrated on specific points in the enemy line to achieve local breakthroughs that could be exploited by follow-up forces. The battle's turning point came when contingents commanded by Witiza's supporters abandoned their positions, leaving gaps in the Visigothic line that Muslim cavalry immediately exploited. Whether this withdrawal represented deliberate treachery, or simply the collapse of units whose commanders had been killed, remains historically unclear, but its effects were immediately catastrophic for Roderick's army. The king himself disappeared during the fighting, with only his horse and royal regalia subsequently recovered from the battlefield. The psychological impact of Guadalete extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The complete destruction of the kingdom's main army, combined with the king's death or disappearance, eliminated the central authority around which resistance might have organised. Visigothic nobles throughout the peninsula faced the choice between futile resistance and negotiated submission, with most choosing the latter option as Muslim forces advanced rapidly toward major population centres. The speed of the Muslim advance following Guadalete reflected both superior organisation and the collapse of Visigothic resistance networks. Within months of the battle, Muslim forces had occupied Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo, encountering minimal opposition from demoralised garrisons. The capture of the Visigothic capital was particularly significant, as it provided Muslim commanders with access to the kingdom's administrative records and treasury, facilitating the transition from military conquest to political administration. Musa ibn Nusayr's arrival in Hispania with reinforcements in 712 marked the beginning of systematic territorial consolidation. Musa brought an additional 18,000 troops, including significant numbers of Arab cavalry and siege specialists, capable of reducing fortified positions that had initially been bypassed. His forces concentrated on securing the peninsula's Mediterranean coast and establishing communications with Muslim territories in North Africa, while Tariq's army continued operations in the interior regions. The division of operational responsibilities between Tariq and Musa reflected standard Umayyad military doctrine for large-scale conquests. Tariq's forces maintained pressure on remaining Visigothic strongholds while preventing the formation of organised resistance movements, while Musa's army focused on establishing the administrative infrastructure necessary for long-term occupation. This coordinated approach enabled Muslim forces to maintain military momentum while simultaneously beginning the complex process of governing conquered territories. The administrative organisation of newly conquered territories followed established Umayyad practices that had proven successful in previous conquests. The peninsula was initially organised as a single province under the authority of a governor appointed directly by the caliph in Damascus, with subordinate administrators responsible for specific regions. This centralised structure ensured unified command while providing flexibility to address local conditions and populations. The appointment of governors reflected the caliphate's need to balance military effectiveness with political reliability. Early governors were typically experienced military commanders who had demonstrated competence in previous campaigns, but they were also required to possess the administrative skills necessary for managing complex civil populations. The governor's authority extended over both military and civilian affairs, making the position one of enormous responsibility and potential influence within the broader Umayyad hierarchy. The establishment of Islamic legal and administrative structures proceeded systematically across conquered territories. Muslim administrators implemented the dhimmi system that had been developed during previous conquests, providing a framework for governing non-Muslim populations according to Islamic law, while preserving certain traditional practices. Christian and other non-Muslim communities were granted protected status in exchange for payment of specific taxes and acceptance of certain legal restrictions. The dhimmi system's practical implementation varied considerably across different regions and communities. Urban Christian populations, particularly those with established ecclesiastical hierarchies, generally received more favourable treatment than rural communities that lacked organised leadership. The system's flexibility allowed Muslim administrators to negotiate specific arrangements with different groups, creating a complex patchwork of local agreements that reflected varying degrees of autonomy and obligation. Christian religious practices continued under Islamic rule, though with significant modifications to their previous status. Churches remained open for worship, and Christian clergy retained authority over their congregation's spiritual affairs, but new church construction required specific permission from Muslim authorities. The collection of ecclesiastical taxes was redirected to Islamic administrators, fundamentally altering the economic foundations of Christian religious institutions. The northern mountainous regions of the peninsula presented unique challenges for Muslim administrators attempting to establish comprehensive control. The rugged terrain of Asturias, Cantabria, and the Pyrenean foothills had historically served as refuges for populations seeking to avoid central authority, and these geographical advantages proved equally valuable against Islamic forces. Small groups of Visigothic nobles and their followers established themselves in remote valleys where cavalry-based Muslim armies could not operate effectively. The resistance movement that emerged in these northern regions initially consisted of scattered bands of refugees rather than organised military forces. These groups included Visigothic nobles who had escaped the disaster at Guadalete, Christian clergy opposed to Islamic rule, and local populations with strong traditions of independence. Their initial activities focused on survival rather than systematic opposition, as they lacked the resources and coordination necessary for effective military operations. The emergence of Pelayo as a leader of northern resistance marked a crucial transition from desperate refuge to organised rebellion. Pelayo's background as a Visigothic noble provided him with the military experience and social connections necessary to unite disparate resistance groups under unified command. His ability to establish a secure base in the Asturian mountains created the foundation for sustained operations against Muslim positions in northern regions. The Battle of Covadonga in 722 represented the first significant military success achieved by Christian resistance forces since the Islamic conquest. The engagement took place in a narrow mountain valley where Muslim cavalry advantages were neutralised by terrain, allowing Christian infantry to achieve tactical parity with their opponents. Pelayo's forces employed guerrilla tactics that maximised their knowledge of local geography while minimising direct confrontation with superior Muslim forces. The battle's strategic significance extended beyond its immediate military results. Covadonga demonstrated that Muslim forces were not invincible and that organised resistance could achieve meaningful victories under favourable conditions. The psychological impact of this success enabled Pelayo to attract additional supporters and establish the foundation for what would eventually become the Kingdom of Asturias, the first stable Christian polity to emerge from the wreckage of the Visigothic kingdom. The establishment of Al-Andalus as a distinct political entity within the Umayyad Caliphate reflected the peninsula's integration into the broader Islamic world. The name itself derived from the Arabic rendering of Vandal, connecting the new Islamic territory to the peninsula's earlier Germanic inhabitants. This nomenclature suggested continuity with previous historical periods, while establishing the region's new Islamic identity within the expanding caliphate. The development of Islamic urban centres proceeded rapidly as Muslim administrators recognised the importance of establishing permanent bases for their authority. Córdoba emerged as the peninsula's primary administrative centre, with extensive construction projects designed to accommodate the growing Muslim population and demonstrate Islamic power. The city's strategic location on the Guadalquivir River provided excellent communications with both the Mediterranean coast and the interior regions, making it an ideal capital for the new province. The political landscape of Al-Andalus underwent a dramatic transformation in 756, when Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, the sole surviving member of the Umayyad dynasty, arrived on Iberian shores, carrying nothing but his determination to reclaim his family's legacy. The young prince's journey to the peninsula represented one of the most remarkable episodes of survival and political resurrection in medieval history, beginning with the catastrophic events that had befallen his family in Damascus just 6 years earlier. The Abbasid revolution of 750 had swept across the Islamic world with unprecedented ferocity, targeting the Umayyad dynasty for complete extermination. The new Abbasid caliphs, claiming legitimacy through their descent from the Prophet's uncle Abbas, systematically hunted down every member of the previous ruling family. The massacre at a supposed reconciliation banquet near the Jordan River eliminated most of the Umayyad princes in a single night of coordinated butchery. Abd al-Rahman, then barely 20 years old, escaped the slaughter only through the quick thinking of his loyal servant, who helped him flee across the Euphrates, while Abbasid soldiers searched every house in Damascus. The prince's 5-year odyssey through North Africa had been a constant struggle for survival. Moving from one Berber tribe to another, he had witnessed firsthand the political fragmentation that characterised the Maghreb in the aftermath of the Abbasid takeover. His mother's Berber ancestry provided crucial connections that kept him alive, but it also made him acutely aware of the ethnic tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Islamic unity. These experiences would prove invaluable when he later attempted to govern the equally complex society of Al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman's decision to cross into Hispania was based on careful intelligence gathering rather than desperate improvisation. His agents had reported that Al-Andalus remained nominally under Abbasid authority, but was effectively controlled by competing factions of Arabs and Berbers, whose loyalties were questionable at best. The province's distance from Baghdad made direct Abbasid intervention difficult, while the mixed population of Arabs, Berbers, and Hispano-Romans created opportunities for a skilled politician to build coalitions across ethnic lines. The prince landed near Al-Munakar on the Granada coast in August 755, with fewer than a dozen supporters, but his Umayyad lineage immediately attracted attention from Arab settlers who had grown increasingly dissatisfied with Abbasid rule. Many of these Arabs were descendants of the original conquest forces who had established themselves as a military aristocracy throughout southern Al-Andalus. They possessed extensive landholdings and commanded significant military resources, but they lacked the dynastic legitimacy necessary to challenge Abbasid authority directly. The existing governor, Yusuf al-Fihri, represented the type of provincial administrator that the Abbasids typically appointed to distant territories. A capable military commander with extensive experience in North African campaigns, Yusuf had maintained relative stability in Al-Andalus through a combination of diplomatic skill and strategic use of force. However, his authority rested entirely on Abbasid support, and his policies had increasingly favoured certain tribal groups over others, creating resentments that Abd al-Rahman could exploit. The young Umayyad prince's initial strategy focused on building a coalition of Arab tribes who had been marginalised under Yusuf's administration. The Yemeni Arabs, in particular, had found themselves excluded from key positions and lucrative appointments, despite their significant role in the original conquest. Abd al-Rahman's agents worked systematically to convince tribal leaders that Umayyad restoration offered better prospects for advancement than continued submission to distant Abbasid authority. The military campaign that followed demonstrated Abd al-Rahman's remarkable ability to transform political support into effective fighting force. His army grew steadily as it advanced through Andalusian territories, with entire tribal contingents switching sides as news of Umayyad victories spread. The prince's personal charisma played a crucial role in these defections, as his bearing and eloquence convinced sceptical commanders that he possessed the qualities necessary for successful leadership. The decisive confrontation with Yusuf's forces took place near Cordoba in May 756, on a broad plain that allowed both armies to deploy their cavalry effectively. Abd al-Rahman commanded approximately 10,000 troops, a mixture of Arab cavalry and Berber infantry whose effectiveness had been tested in previous engagements. Yusuf's army was larger, but included significant numbers of recently recruited troops, whose loyalty remained questionable under battlefield conditions. The battle itself unfolded according to classical Islamic tactical principles, with both sides employing the traditional formation of centre infantry supported by cavalry wings. Abd al-Rahman positioned himself prominently in the front ranks, his distinctive white banner clearly visible to both his supporters and enemies. This personal leadership style, which he had learned during his years of exile, proved crucial in maintaining unit cohesion during the intense fighting that followed. The turning point came when several of Yusuf's tribal contingents recognised the futility of continued resistance and began withdrawing from the battlefield. These defections created gaps in the loyalist line that Abd al-Rahman's cavalry immediately exploited, transforming what had been a closely contested engagement into a rout. Yusuf himself was killed while attempting to rally his remaining forces, eliminating the last significant obstacle to Umayyad control of Al-Andalus. The establishment of the independent Umayyad Emirate required more than military victory. It demanded the creation of entirely new governmental structures that could function without reference to external authority. Abd al-Rahman, now styling himself as Emir Abd al-Rahman I, faced the complex challenge of governing a territory that had never existed as an independent political entity. His solution was to adapt traditional Islamic administrative practices to local conditions while maintaining the essential symbols and ceremonies of legitimate rule. The new emir's approach to governance reflected his understanding that successful rule in Al-Andalus required balancing the competing interests of multiple ethnic and religious communities. The Arab military aristocracy expected to maintain their privileged position as the conquest elite, while Berber tribes demanded recognition of their crucial role in establishing Umayyad authority. The Hispano-Roman population, now increasingly referred to as muwallads as they converted to Islam, sought opportunities for advancement within the new system. Abd al-Rahman's administrative innovations began with the establishment of a professional bureaucracy that could function independently of tribal loyalties. He recruited talented administrators from all ethnic backgrounds, promoting individuals based on competence rather than ancestry. This meritocratic approach created a class of civil servants whose primary loyalty was to the emirate itself, rather than to particular tribal or ethnic groups. The military organisation of the new emirate reflected similar pragmatic considerations. Abd al-Rahman maintained the traditional Arab cavalry units that formed the core of his fighting force, but he also incorporated Berber infantry and began recruiting from the Hispano-Roman population. This mixed military structure provided tactical flexibility while distributing the burden of military service across different communities, reducing the dominance of any single group. The consolidation of Umayyad power required systematic campaigns against both internal opponents and external threats. The northern frontier remained contested territory, where Christian kingdoms were beginning to organise effective resistance, while various Muslim factions throughout Al-Andalus continued to challenge emirate authority. Abd al-Rahman's military strategy focused on eliminating these threats systematically while avoiding the type of overextension that had weakened previous rulers. The campaign against the Abbasid expedition of 763 demonstrated the emirate's growing military effectiveness. When the Abbasid Caliph finally dispatched a substantial force to restore his authority in Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman's army met the invaders with confidence and superior knowledge of local terrain. The resulting battle near Carmona resulted in a decisive Umayyad victory that effectively ended Abbasid hopes of reconquering the peninsula through military force. The development of Cordoba as the emirate's capital reflected Abd al-Rahman's vision of creating a worthy successor to Damascus. The city's existing Roman and Visigothic infrastructure provided an excellent foundation for expansion, while its location on the Guadalquivir River ensured excellent communications with both the Mediterranean coast and the interior regions. The emir's construction projects transformed Cordoba from a provincial administrative centre into a magnificent capital that rivaled the great cities of the Islamic world. The expansion of the Great Mosque of Cordoba began during Abd al-Rahman's reign and continued under his successors, eventually becoming one of the architectural marvels of medieval Europe. The mosque's distinctive horseshoe arches and alternating red and white stonework created a visual style that was uniquely Andalusian, while maintaining clear connections to broader Islamic architectural traditions. The building's massive prayer hall could accommodate thousands of worshippers, reflecting both the city's growing Muslim population and the emirate's increasing prosperity. The mosque construction employed skilled craftsmen from throughout the Mediterranean world, including Christian artisans whose techniques were incorporated into Islamic decorative schemes. The resulting synthesis of architectural traditions produced innovations that would influence building styles throughout the Western Islamic world. The mosque's distinctive mihrab, completed during the reign of Abd al-Rahman's successors, featured intricate geometric patterns and calligraphic inscriptions that represented the highest achievements of Andalusian decorative arts. The economic foundations of the emirate's prosperity rested on the peninsula's agricultural productivity and its strategic position controlling trade routes between Europe and Africa. The Guadalquivir Valley's fertile soils supported extensive cultivation of grains, olives and grapes, while the introduction of new crops from the Islamic world expanded agricultural possibilities. irrigation systems originally developed during Roman times were expanded and improved, supporting more intensive cultivation and higher population densities. The emergence of Mozarabic Christian communities represented one of the most distinctive features of Andalusian society. These Christians, who adopted Arabic language and Islamic cultural practices while maintaining their religious identity, occupied a unique position within the Emirate's social hierarchy. Their knowledge of both Christian and Islamic traditions made them valuable intermediaries in diplomatic and commercial relationships, while their technical skills contributed significantly to the Emirate's economic development. Mozarabic communities developed their own distinctive cultural identity that blended Christian theological traditions with Islamic social practices. Their churches featured architectural elements borrowed from mosque design, while their liturgical practices incorporated Arabic musical forms and poetic structures. This cultural synthesis created a unique form of Christianity that was distinctly Andalusian, while maintaining connections to broader Christian traditions. The legal status of Mozarabic communities reflected the complex realities of governing a religiously diverse population. While Islamic law theoretically governed all aspects of life within the emirate, practical considerations required accommodation of Christian legal traditions in matters relating to marriage, inheritance, and commercial relationships. This legal pluralism created opportunities for forum shopping and jurisdictional disputes, but it also provided flexibility that helped maintain social stability. The development of Arabic as the Emirate's administrative and cultural language proceeded gradually but inexorably throughout Abd al-Rahman's reign. While Latin remained the language of Christian religious services and Romance dialects continued to be spoken in rural areas, Arabic became essential for advancement in government service or commercial activities. This linguistic transformation facilitated communication across ethnic boundaries while creating new forms of cultural expression that were distinctly Andalusian. The transformation of the Umayyad Emirate into a full caliphate represented far more than a mere change in title when Abd al-Rahman III proclaimed himself Commander of the Faithful in 929. This declaration constituted a direct challenge to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and marked the definitive break of Al-Andalus from any pretense of Eastern Islamic authority. The political significance of this act reverberated throughout the Islamic world as Abd al-Rahman III asserted not only his independence from Baghdad, but his equality with the Abbasid and Fatimid caliphs, who claimed universal authority over all Muslims. The circumstances that led to this momentous decision had been building throughout the early decades of the 10th century. The Abbasid Caliphate's authority had been steadily fragmenting as provincial governors established de facto independence while maintaining nominal allegiance to Baghdad. Simultaneously, the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa created a competing centre of Islamic authority that directly threatened Umayyad interests in the Western Mediterranean. The Fatimids' aggressive expansion eastward toward Egypt, and their claims to represent the true Islamic succession, forced Abd al-Rahman III to respond with equally bold assertions of legitimacy. The new caliph's assumption of the title Al-Nasir li-Din Allah, Defender of God's Religion, carried profound theological and political implications. Unlike the Emirate, which had governed Al-Andalus as a regional political entity, the Caliphate claimed spiritual authority over all Muslims within its territories and beyond. This transformation required the development of new ceremonial protocols, administrative structures, and diplomatic relationships that reflected Cordoba's enhanced status within the Islamic world. The physical manifestation of this elevated status became apparent in the massive expansion of the palace complex at Madinat al-Zahra, begun in 936 as Abd al-Rahman III's new administrative centre. Located on the slopes of the Sierra Morena northwest of Cordoba, this Palatine city was designed to rival the great palace complexes of Baghdad and Cairo. The construction project employed thousands of skilled craftsmen and consumed enormous resources, but it served the crucial political purpose of demonstrating that the Cordoban Caliphate possessed the wealth and sophistication necessary to support such magnificent displays of power. The palace's architectural program incorporated elements from throughout the Islamic world while developing distinctively Andalusian innovations. The reception halls featured elaborate geometric decorations executed in carved marble and stucco, while the private apartments included sophisticated hydraulic systems that supplied running water and operated decorative fountains. The complex's gardens employed advanced irrigation techniques to maintain lush vegetation in the Mediterranean climate, creating an earthly paradise that symbolized the caliph's divine mandate to rule. The military campaigns that established Abd al-Rahman III's reputation as a formidable commander began with the systematic reduction of rebel strongholds that had challenged Umayyad authority throughout the early 10th century. The most significant of these operations targeted the fortress of Bobastro, which had served as the centre of Ibn Hafsun's rebellion for over 4 decades. This stronghold, perched on a virtually impregnable rocky outcrop in the Malaga Mountains, had become a symbol of resistance to central authority and a refuge for various dissident groups. The siege of Bobastro required innovative military engineering and sustained logistical support that demonstrated the caliphate's enhanced organisational capabilities. Abd al-Rahman III's engineers constructed elaborate siege works that gradually tightened the noose around the fortress, while his supply trains maintained the besieging army through multiple campaigning seasons. The fortress finally surrendered in 928, eliminating the last major internal threat to Umayyad authority and freeing the caliph's forces for operations against external enemies. The northern frontier campaigns against the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile and Navarre represented the most sustained military effort of Abd al-Rahman III's reign. These operations were not random raids for plunder, but carefully coordinated strategic campaigns designed to prevent Christian consolidation while extending Islamic control into the Duero Valley. The Caliph personally led many of these expeditions, demonstrating his commitment to the frontier struggle and inspiring his troops through direct participation in combat. The campaign of 939 against Ramiro II of Leon illustrated both the potential and limitations of Cordoban military power. Abd al-Rahman III assembled a massive army that included contingents from throughout Al-Andalus, supported by siege engines and extensive supply trains. The Christian forces that met this invasion at Simancas employed defensive tactics that maximised their knowledge of local terrain while avoiding direct confrontation with superior Muslim cavalry. The resulting battle became a tactical disaster for the Cordoban forces, with the Caliph himself barely escaping capture when his army disintegrated under sustained Christian attacks. The defeat at Simancas forced a fundamental reassessment of military strategy and led to significant reforms in the organisation and tactics of Cordoban armies. Abd al-Rahman III recognised that the traditional reliance on tribal cavalry, while effective in open terrain, was inadequate for operations in the mountainous regions where Christian forces typically chose to fight. His military reforms emphasised the development of professional infantry units equipped with improved armour and weapons, while new tactical manuals addressed the specific challenges of frontier warfare. The recovery from the Simancas disaster demonstrated the underlying strength of the Cordoban state and Abd al-Rahman III's political skill in maintaining support despite military setbacks. Rather than abandoning frontier operations entirely, the Caliph adopted a more cautious approach that emphasised the construction of fortified bases and the establishment of reliable supply lines. This methodical strategy proved more effective than previous aggressive campaigns, gradually extending Cordoban control northward while avoiding the type of catastrophic defeats that could destabilise the entire kingdom. The reign of Al-Hakam II, who succeeded his father in 961, marked the zenith of Cordoban cultural and intellectual achievement. The new caliph's passion for learning and scholarship transformed Cordoba into one of Europe's most important centres of intellectual activity, rivaling Baghdad and Cairo in the breadth and sophistication of its scholarly institutions. Al-Hakam's personal library reportedly contained over 400,000 volumes, making it one of the largest collections of books in the medieval world. The caliph's patronage extended to scholars from throughout the Islamic world and beyond, creating an international community of intellectuals who made Cordoba a centre for translation, commentary, and original research. Greek philosophical texts that had been lost in Western Europe were preserved and studied in Arabic translation, while original works in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and jurisprudence advanced human knowledge in multiple fields. The city's madrasas and libraries attracted students from as far away as Central Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, establishing Cordoba's reputation as a premier destination for Islamic learning. The translation movement that flourished under Al-Hakam II's patronage played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting classical knowledge to later generations. Teams of translators working in the palace library produced Arabic versions of Greek scientific and philosophical works, often improving upon the original texts through detailed commentary and analysis. These translations would later be rendered into Latin by scholars in Christian kingdoms, facilitating the transmission of classical learning to medieval Europe. The development of distinctive Andalusian schools of Islamic jurisprudence reflected the intellectual sophistication that characterized the caliphate during this period. Cordoban legal scholars developed innovative approaches to interpreting Islamic law that addressed the specific conditions of life in Al-Andalus, while maintaining orthodoxy with broader Islamic legal traditions. Their legal opinions and commentaries influenced Islamic jurisprudence throughout the Western Mediterranean and established Cordoba's reputation as a centre of religious learning. The artistic achievements of the caliphal period represented a synthesis of influences from throughout the Islamic world, combined with local innovations that created distinctively Andalusian forms of expression. The decorative programs of major architectural projects employed sophisticated geometric patterns and calligraphic inscriptions that demonstrated both technical mastery and aesthetic refinement. The ivory caskets produced in Cordoban workshops during this period are considered among the finest examples of Islamic decorative art, combining intricate carving with sophisticated iconographic programs. The economic foundations of this cultural flowering rested on the caliphate's control of lucrative trade routes, connecting Europe with Africa and the Eastern Islamic world. Cordoba's merchants established commercial networks that extended from the North Sea to the Sahara, trading European furs and amber for African gold and ivory. The city's workshops produced luxury goods that were highly prized throughout the Mediterranean, while its agricultural hinterland supplied the foodstuffs necessary to support a large urban population. The diplomatic relationships that the Cordoban Caliphate maintained with distant powers reflected its emergence as a major player in Mediterranean politics. Byzantine emperors sought Cordoban support against Fatimid expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean, while European rulers recognized the Caliphate as a legitimate sovereign power worthy of formal diplomatic recognition. These relationships were maintained through elaborate embassy exchanges that demonstrated the Caliphate's wealth and sophistication to foreign observers. The most significant of these diplomatic relationships was the complex interaction with the Byzantine Empire, which shared the Caliphate's opposition to Fatimid expansion, but remained suspicious of Islamic power in the Western Mediterranean. The exchange of embassies between Constantinople and Cordoba resulted in detailed accounts of both courts that provide valuable insights into 10th century diplomatic practices. Byzantine observers were consistently impressed by the wealth and sophistication they encountered in Cordoba, while Cordoban diplomats reported extensively on Byzantine military capabilities and political organisation. The rise of Al-Mansur during the final decades of the 10th century marked a fundamental transformation in the character of the Cordoban state. Muhammad ibn Abi Amir, who adopted the title Al-Mansur bi Allah, made victorious by God, emerged from the administrative hierarchy to become the de facto ruler of the caliphate, while the legitimate caliph Hisham II remained secluded in the palace. This concentration of power in the hands of a military dictator represented a departure from the established traditions of Umayyad governance, but it also enabled the caliphate to achieve unprecedented military successes against its Christian neighbours. Almanzor's military campaigns against the northern Christian kingdoms were characterized by their systematic nature and devastating effectiveness. Unlike previous frontier operations that had often been limited raids for plunder, Almanzor's expeditions were carefully planned strategic campaigns designed to cripple Christian military capabilities and prevent the formation of effective coalitions against Islamic power. His forces employed sophisticated intelligence networks to identify vulnerable targets, while avoiding heavily defended positions that might result in costly sieges. The sack of Santiago de Compostela in 997 represented the pinnacle of Almanzor's military achievements, and one of the most shocking events in medieval Iberian history. The destruction of Christianity's most important pilgrimage site in the peninsula sent reverberations throughout Christian Europe, while demonstrating the extent of Islamic military superiority during this period. Almanzor's forces systematically dismantled the cathedral and carried away its bells to Cordoba, where they were incorporated into the Great Mosque as symbols of Islamic triumph. The administrative and military innovations that enabled Almanzor's successes fundamentally altered the structure of the Cordoban state. His creation of a professional army loyal to him personally, rather than to the Umayyad dynasty, represented a break with traditional Islamic military organisation. This force included significant numbers of Berber troops recruited from North Africa, as well as Christian mercenaries whose effectiveness in familiar terrain made them valuable additions to Islamic armies. The economic strain imposed by Almanzor's constant military campaigns began to undermine the foundations of Cordoban prosperity, even as his armies achieved unprecedented victories. The enormous costs of maintaining large professional forces in the field required increased taxation that burdened both urban and rural populations. The disruption of normal economic activities caused by frequent military mobilizations reduced agricultural productivity and commercial activity, while the concentration of resources on military expenditures left less available for the cultural and intellectual activities that had distinguished the caliphate during its earlier phases. The succession crisis that followed Almanzor's death in 1002 revealed the extent to which his personal rule had destabilized traditional Umayyad institutions. His son Abd al-Malik attempted to maintain his father's system of military dictatorship, but he lacked the personal charisma and political skill necessary to hold together the complex coalition of interests that had supported Almanzor's regime. The death of Abd al-Malik in 1008 precipitated a complete breakdown of central authority that would ultimately destroy the caliphate as an effective political entity. The collapse of centralized authority in Cordoba following the succession crisis of 1008 to 1031 unleashed forces that had been building beneath the surface of Umayyad rule for generations. The Fitna Civil War, as contemporary chroniclers termed this period of chaos, witnessed the systematic destruction of the administrative and military structures that had maintained Islamic unity across the peninsula for 3 centuries. What emerged from this breakdown was not another unified Islamic state, but rather a constellation of independent kingdoms known as the Taifa states, each ruled by ambitious military commanders, tribal leaders, or local notables who carved out territories from the wreckage of the once mighty caliphate. The fragmentation process began in earnest after the death of Abd al-Rahman Sanchuelo in 1009, when the last vestiges of Almanzor's military dictatorship crumbled under pressure from competing factions within Cordoba itself. The Umayyad pretender Muhammad al-Mahdi managed to restore nominal caliphal authority for brief periods, but his reign was punctuated by constant rebellions and military coups that demonstrated the impossibility of reconstituting effective central government. The sack of Cordoba by Berber forces in 1013 marked the definitive end of the city's role as the undisputed centre of Iberian Islamic power, as rival claimants established competing courts in different regions of Al-Andalus. The emergence of the first Taifa kingdoms reflected the underlying ethnic and regional tensions that Umayyad rule had managed to contain but never fully resolve. In Seville, the Abbadid family established control through their leadership of the Arab population, creating a kingdom that would eventually dominate much of southwestern Al-Andalus. The Abbadids traced their lineage to prominent Arab families from the original conquest period, and their rule represented the assertion of Arab ethnic identity against both Berber and Slavic competitors for regional dominance. The Berber populations that had played such a crucial role in Al-Mansur's military machine established their own independent kingdoms throughout southern and eastern Al-Andalus. The Zirid kingdom of Granada emerged as the most significant of these Berber states, controlling the rich agricultural valleys of the Janil and Darro rivers, along with the strategic mountain passes that connected the Mediterranean coast with the interior plateau. The Zirid's military effectiveness, honed through generations of frontier warfare, enabled them to maintain independence against both Christian and Muslim competitors, while establishing Granada as a major centre of Islamic culture and learning. The Slavic military commanders who had served as the backbone of the later Umayyad military establishment created several small but strategically important kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast. These Slavic rulers, many of whom had originally been captured as children during raids into Christian territories and raised as Muslim military slaves, possessed intimate knowledge of both Islamic and Christian military practices that proved invaluable in the complex warfare that characterized the Taifa period. The kingdom of Zaragoza, established by the Tujibid family, represented a different model of Taifa formation based on control of crucial frontier territories. The Tujibids had served as Umayyad governors of the Upper March for generations, developing extensive networks of local alliances and detailed knowledge of the region's complex geography. Their kingdom encompassed the fertile Ebro Valley along with the mountain fortresses that controlled access to the Christian kingdoms of Navarre and Aragon, making Zaragoza a crucial player in the shifting balance of power between Islamic and Christian forces. The proliferation of independent Taifa kingdoms created unprecedented opportunities for the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia, which had spent centuries struggling against the overwhelming military superiority of unified Islamic power. The fragmentation of Al-Andalus meant that Christian rulers no longer faced a single coordinated enemy, capable of mounting massive campaigns like those of Abd al-Rahman III or Al-Mansur. Instead, they encountered a collection of rival Islamic states whose mutual hostilities could be exploited through careful diplomacy and selective military intervention. The Kingdom of Leon, under the dynamic leadership of Alfonso V and his successors, began the systematic expansion southward that would characterize Christian policy throughout the Taifa period. The Leonese monarchy had survived the devastating campaigns of Al-Mansur's era by developing defensive strategies based on fortified strongholds and mobile cavalry forces that could avoid direct confrontation with superior Islamic armies. The collapse of Cordoban power allowed these same military techniques to be employed offensively, as Leonese forces began occupying territories that had been under Islamic control for centuries. The emergence of Castile as an independent kingdom under Ferdinand I marked a crucial development in the balance of peninsular power. The Castilian monarchy's origins lay in the frontier counties that had borne the brunt of Islamic attacks during the previous century, creating a military culture that emphasized aggressive expansion and systematic colonization of conquered territories. Ferdinand's assumption of the imperial title following his conquest of Leon in 1037 reflected Castilian ambitions to lead the Christian reconquest of the entire peninsula. The Kingdom of Navarre, despite its relatively small size, played a disproportionately important role in the new political landscape due to its strategic position, controlling the western Pyrenean passes. Sancho III the Great had transformed Navarre from a minor mountain kingdom into a major regional power through a combination of military conquest, dynastic marriages, and diplomatic alliances that extended Navarre's influence throughout northern Iberia. His division of his territories among his sons created the framework for the multiple Christian kingdoms that would dominate the Taifa period. The county of Barcelona emerged as the leading power in the Eastern Pyrenees through its successful combination of military expansion with sophisticated administrative organisation. The Catalan counts had maintained their independence from both Frankish and Islamic overlordship through careful diplomacy and effective military organisation, developing institutional structures that proved highly effective in governing newly conquered territories. Barcelona's control of Mediterranean trade routes provided the economic resources necessary to support sustained military campaigns against neighbouring Islamic kingdoms. The Kingdom of Aragon, carved out of the mountainous regions between Navarre and Barcelona, represented the most dramatic example of Christian territorial expansion during the early Taifa period. Beginning as a small county centred on the valley of the Aragon River, this kingdom expanded rapidly southward under kings like Sancho Ramirez and Peter I, who employed innovative siege techniques and systematic colonisation policies to consolidate their conquests. The capture of Huesca in 1096 and Zaragoza in 1118 would demonstrate Aragonese military effectiveness against even the strongest Islamic opponents. The development of the Prius tribute system represented one of the most significant innovations of the Taifa period, fundamentally altering the economic relationships between Christian and Islamic kingdoms. This system, which required Taifa rulers to pay regular tribute to Christian monarchs in exchange for military protection or non-aggression agreements, reversed the traditional flow of wealth that had characterized earlier centuries when Islamic rulers had extracted tribute from Christian territories. The Prius system emerged from the military realities of the new political landscape, as Taifa rulers recognized that their fragmented kingdoms could not individually match the military resources of the expanding Christian monarchies. Rather than face certain destruction through military conquest, many Taifa rulers chose to purchase security through regular tribute payments that allowed them to maintain internal autonomy while acknowledging Christian superiority in military affairs. The economic impact of the Prius system on Christian kingdoms was transformative, providing unprecedented resources for military expansion, architectural projects, and administrative development. The gold that flowed northward from the Taifa kingdoms enabled Christian rulers to hire mercenary forces, construct sophisticated fortifications, and support the religious institutions that legitimized their expanding authority. The tribute system also created powerful incentives for Christian rulers to maintain the independence of their Islamic tributaries rather than conquering them outright, as living kingdoms could provide continuous revenue streams that exceeded the one-time profits of military conquest. For the Taifa kingdoms themselves, the Prius system represented a complex balance between survival and gradual subordination. The tribute payments required to maintain Christian protection placed enormous strains on royal treasuries, forcing Taifa rulers to increase taxation on their subjects and reduce expenditures on military forces and public works. This economic pressure gradually weakened the Taifa kingdom's capacity for independent action while increasing their dependence on Christian goodwill for survival. The military orders that emerged during this period represented a distinctive fusion of religious devotion with systematic military organisation that would profoundly influence the character of Christian expansion. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170, embodied the concept of armed pilgrimage that had been developing throughout the 11th century as Christian forces advanced toward the shrine of Santiago de Compostela. The Order's knights took monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, while dedicating themselves to perpetual warfare against Islamic forces. The development of Reconquista ideology during the Taifa period transformed what had previously been sporadic frontier warfare into a systematic religious crusade with clearly defined spiritual and political objectives. This ideological framework provided Christian rulers with powerful legitimizing narratives that justified territorial expansion as divinely mandated missions to restore Christian rule to lands that had been lost to Islamic conquest centuries earlier. The concept of Reconquista drew upon both indigenous Iberian traditions of resistance to foreign rule and broader European ideas about holy war that were developing in response to Islamic expansion in other theatres. The discovery and promotion of the tomb of Santiago de Compostela provided a powerful focal point for Christian identity that rivaled the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, while the development of elaborate foundation myths connected contemporary Christian kingdoms to the Visigothic monarchy that had ruled the peninsula before the Islamic conquest. The practical implementation of Reconquista ideology varied significantly among different Christian kingdoms, reflecting their distinct political traditions and strategic circumstances. The Leonese monarchy emphasised its role as the legitimate heir to Visigothic authority, claiming the right to rule all territories that had previously been under Christian control. Castilian rulers adopted a more aggressive interpretation that justified unlimited expansion southward as a divine mission to liberate Christian populations living under Islamic rule. The military innovations that accompanied Christian expansion during the Taifa period reflected both technological developments and tactical adaptations to the specific challenges of siege warfare against Islamic fortifications. The introduction of more sophisticated siege engines, including torsion catapults and early forms of gunpowder weapons, enabled Christian forces to reduce fortified positions that had previously been considered impregnable. The development of professional engineering corps within Christian armies provided the technical expertise necessary to conduct complex siege operations over extended periods. The colonization policies that Christian kingdoms employed in newly conquered territories represented systematic attempts to ensure permanent control through demographic transformation. The fueros, or charter privileges granted to Christian settlers in frontier towns, provided attractive incentives for colonization, while establishing legal frameworks that favoured Christian over Islamic populations. These settlement policies often included provisions for the expulsion or forced conversion of Muslim populations, fundamentally altering the religious and ethnic composition of conquered territories. The administrative structures that Christian kingdoms developed to govern their expanding territories drew upon both their own institutional traditions and Islamic administrative practices that had proven effective in managing complex, ethnically diverse populations. The emergence of professional bureaucracies staffed by educated clerics provided the administrative capacity necessary to collect taxes, maintain legal systems, and coordinate military operations across extensive territories. The desperate situation facing the Taifa kingdoms by the 1080s created conditions that would fundamentally transform the political landscape of medieval Iberia. The relentless pressure of Christian expansion, combined with the crushing burden of Pariah's tribute payments, had reduced many Islamic rulers to mere vassals of their northern neighbours. The capture of Toledo by Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085 sent shockwaves throughout Al-Andalus, as this ancient Visigothic capital represented far more than a strategic prize. It symbolised the inexorable advance of Christian reconquest toward the heartland of Islamic Spain. The fall of Toledo exposed the military weakness that had become endemic among the Taifa kingdoms. The city's Islamic garrison, demoralised by years of tribute payments and political instability, offered only token resistance to Alfonso's siege engines. The Castilian king's systematic approach to the siege demonstrated the technological and organisational advantages that Christian forces had developed during decades of successful expansion. His engineers employed sophisticated countermine techniques to neutralise the defenders' attempts at tunnel warfare, while his supply trains maintained the besieging army through an entire winter campaign season. Alfonso VI's treatment of Toledo's conquered population revealed the increasingly harsh character of Christian expansion during this period. While earlier conquests had often preserved existing Islamic administrative structures and religious practices, the Castilian king implemented policies designed to transform Toledo into an unambiguously Christian city. The conversion of the main mosque into a cathedral proceeded immediately after the city's surrender, while new settlement policies encouraged Christian colonization of the surrounding countryside. The psychological impact of Toledo's fall reverberated throughout the remaining Taifa kingdoms, forcing their rulers to confront the reality that traditional defensive strategies were no longer sufficient to ensure survival. The city had been considered one of the strongest fortresses in Al-Andalus, protected by massive walls built on Roman foundations and defended by experienced garrison troops. Its rapid collapse demonstrated that no Islamic stronghold could withstand determined Christian assault if left to fight alone. The appeals for assistance that began arriving in North Africa during 1085 represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between Iberian and Maghrebi Islamic communities. Previous contacts had been limited to commercial relationships and occasional diplomatic exchanges, but the crisis facing Al-Andalus now required direct military intervention from across the strait. The Taifa rulers who dispatched these urgent embassies understood that they were effectively acknowledging their inability to defend Islamic territories without external support. The Almoravid movement that dominated the Maghreb during this period represented a puritanical reform movement that had emerged from the Saharan tribes of the Western Sudan. The Almoravids, whose name derived from the Arabic al-Murabitun meaning those who bind themselves, had originated as a religious brotherhood dedicated to strict adherence to Islamic law and the elimination of what they considered corrupt innovations in religious practice. Their military expansion across North Africa had been driven by a combination of religious fervour and the practical advantages that their disciplined organisation provided in desert warfare. The founder of Almoravid power, Abdullah ibn Yassin, had established his movement's distinctive character through rigorous religious education combined with military training that emphasised discipline and collective action over individual heroism. The ribat or fortified monasteries that served as centres of Almoravid organisation provided both spiritual instruction and military preparation for warriors who saw themselves as engaged in perpetual holy war against the enemies of true Islam. This combination of religious devotion with systematic military organisation created fighting forces of exceptional effectiveness and morale. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who had assumed leadership of the Almoravid Confederation following Abdullah ibn Yassin's death in battle, brought to the movement the strategic vision necessary to transform it from a regional religious brotherhood into a major imperial power. His conquest of Morocco had been accomplished through a series of carefully planned campaigns that combined traditional Berber mobility with innovative siege techniques adapted from Islamic military manuals. The establishment of Marrakesh as his capital provided a strategic base for operations that could support expansion in multiple directions. The Almoravid military system represented a synthesis of Saharan tribal traditions, with classical Islamic military doctrine that proved remarkably effective against both sedentary and nomadic opponents. The core of Almoravid armies consisted of camel-mounted warriors whose mobility and endurance had been developed through generations of desert warfare. These forces could cover vast distances without logistical support, appearing suddenly at strategic points where their concentrated attacks could achieve decisive results before disappearing back into the desert. The religious ideology that motivated Almoravid expansion emphasized the purification of Islamic practice through the elimination of innovations and the strict enforcement of Maliki legal interpretations. This puritanical approach placed the Almoravids in direct opposition to the more relaxed religious practices that had developed in the Taifa kingdoms, where centuries of coexistence with Christian and other non-Muslim populations had created syncretic cultural forms that orthodox reformers considered corrupting influences on true Islamic faith. The decision to intervene in Iberian affairs required careful consideration of the strategic implications for Almoravid interests in North Africa. Yusuf ibn Tashfin understood that military operations across the strait would require substantial commitments of men and resources that might leave his Maghrebi territories vulnerable to attack from rival powers. The Fatimid presence in eastern North Africa and the continuing resistance of various Berber confederations to Almoravid authority meant that any Iberian expedition would need to achieve rapid, decisive results to avoid dangerous overextension. The embassy that arrived in Marrakesh from the Taifa rulers presented their request for assistance in terms that appealed directly to Almoravid religious sensibilities. Rather than simply asking for military support against Christian enemies, the Iberian rulers portrayed their situation as a crisis of Islamic faith threatened by infidel aggression. They emphasized the desecration of mosques, the forced conversion of Muslim populations, and the general decline of Islamic religious practice under Christian pressure as justifications for immediate intervention. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's initial response to these appeals reflected both his genuine religious concerns and his practical assessment of the military situation in Al-Andalus. the Almoravid leader dispatched reconnaissance missions across the strait to evaluate the strength of both Christian and Islamic forces, while his agents gathered detailed intelligence about the political divisions that weakened potential resistance to intervention. These preliminary investigations revealed that the Taifa kingdoms possessed substantial resources but lacked the unity and leadership necessary to employ them effectively. The preparation for the Almoravid expedition required months of careful logistical planning and military organisation. The movement of large forces across the Strait of Gibraltar presented significant challenges, as the Almoravids lacked the naval resources necessary to transport entire armies with their equipment and supplies. The solution involved negotiations with various maritime communities along the Moroccan coast, whose ships were requisitioned or hired to provide the transport capacity required for the crossing. The Almoravid army that assembled for the Iberian expedition represented the largest military force that had crossed from North Africa since the original Islamic conquest 4 centuries earlier. Contemporary sources describe a host of approximately 15,000 warriors, including elite camel cavalry, Berber infantry armed with traditional weapons, and specialised units equipped with siege engines and other military equipment adapted from Islamic military treatises. The army's composition reflected the diverse tribal origins of the Almoravid Confederation, with contingents from throughout Morocco and the Western Sahara. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's personal leadership of the expedition demonstrated the importance that the Almoravid movement placed on the Iberian intervention. The presence of the Supreme Commander ensured unified direction of military operations, while providing the religious authority necessary to legitimate whatever political arrangements might emerge from successful campaigns. His decision to cross personally also reflected confidence in the stability of Almoravid control over North African territories. As such, extended absence would have been impossible if serious threats existed to the movement's Maghrebi base. The landing of Almoravid forces at Algeciras in June 1086 marked the beginning of a new phase in Iberian Islamic history that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between Christian and Muslim forces. The choice of landing site reflected careful strategic planning, as Algeciras provided excellent harbour facilities while offering direct access to the interior valleys where the main Christian armies were operating. The port's existing Islamic population provided immediate logistical support and intelligence about Christian military dispositions. The reaction of the Taifa rulers to the Almoravid arrival revealed the complex mixture of relief and apprehension that characterised their attitude toward these North African allies. While they desperately needed military assistance against Christian expansion, they also recognised that the Almoravids represented a potentially serious threat to their own independence. The puritanical religious ideology of the North African warriors was fundamentally incompatible with the sophisticated court culture that had developed in the Taifa kingdoms during decades of relative autonomy. Alfonso VI's response to intelligence reports about the Almoravid landing demonstrated both the strategic acumen that had made him the most successful Christian ruler of his generation and his perhaps excessive confidence in Castilian military superiority. Rather than adopting defensive positions that might have allowed him to choose the time and place of engagement, the Castilian king decided to seek immediate battle with the invading forces before they could consolidate their position or receive significant reinforcements from the Taifa kingdoms. The Christian army that Alfonso assembled to confront the Almoravid threat represented the largest force that Castile had ever deployed for a single campaign. The king's summons brought together not only his own vassals and retainers, but also contingents from Leon, troops provided by various military orders, and foreign knights who had been attracted to Iberia by the prospect of warfare against Islamic forces. Contemporary chronicles describe a host of approximately 60,000 men, though this figure likely includes significant numbers of non-combatant support personnel. The Battle of Sagregas, fought on October 23, 1086, near the fortress of Badajoz, became one of the most decisive engagements in medieval Iberian history. The battlefield itself was a gently rolling plain that provided excellent terrain for cavalry operations, allowing both armies to deploy their mounted forces effectively. Alfonso VI positioned his army in traditional formation, with heavy cavalry on the wings and infantry in the centre, a deployment that had proven successful in previous campaigns against Taifa forces. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's tactical approach reflected both classical Islamic military doctrine and innovations developed through Almoravid experience in Saharan warfare. The North African commander positioned his camel cavalry in the centre of his line, where their unusual mounts would have maximum psychological impact on Christian horses unfamiliar with such animals. Berber-like cavalry occupied the wings, where their mobility could be employed to harass enemy formations and exploit any gaps that developed in the Christian line. The battle began with traditional cavalry charges as both armies sought to achieve early advantage through shock action. The Christian heavy cavalry initially achieved significant success against Berber light horse, driving back the Islamic wings and threatening to envelop the Almoravid centre. Alfonso VI's personal leadership during these early phases of the engagement inspired his troops and seemed to promise another victory against Islamic forces that had become routine during the previous decade. The turning point came when the Almoravid camel cavalry launched their coordinated charge against the Christian centre. The unfamiliar sight and smell of the camels caused panic among Christian horses, disrupting formations that had maintained cohesion during the initial cavalry exchanges. The psychological impact of this disruption was amplified by the disciplined advance of Berber infantry, whose traditional weapons and fighting techniques proved highly effective in close combat against disorganised Christian forces. The collapse of Christian resistance occurred with shocking suddenness as unit after unit broke and fled from the battlefield. Alfonso VI himself was wounded during the fighting and barely escaped capture when his bodyguard was overwhelmed by pursuing Almoravid cavalry. The Castilian baggage train, containing the accumulated plunder of decades of successful campaigns against the Taifa kingdoms, fell intact into North African hands, along with the royal standard and other symbols of Christian military prestige. The immediate aftermath of Sagrejas revealed the extent of the Christian disaster, while demonstrating the strategic limitations that would ultimately constrain Almoravid's success in Iberia. The scattered remnants of Alfonso's army were unable to offer coordinated resistance to Almoravid advances, allowing North African forces to occupy extensive territories throughout southwestern Al-Andalus. However, Yusuf ibn Tashfin's decision to return to Morocco, rather than pressing his advantage toward Toledo, reflected the logistical difficulties of maintaining large armies across the strait for extended periods. The political consequences of the Almoravid victory extended far beyond its immediate military results. The demonstration that Christian expansion could be halted and reversed encouraged Islamic resistance throughout the peninsula while undermining the tribute relationships that had provided crucial revenue for Christian kingdoms. Several Taifa rulers who had been paying pariahs to Castile immediately ceased these payments, while others began actively supporting Almoravid operations against their former Christian overlords. The temporary unification of Al-Andalus under Almoravid authority proceeded systematically as North African forces returned to the peninsula in subsequent campaigns. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's strategy involved the gradual elimination of Taifa independence through a combination of military pressure and religious legitimation. Taifa rulers who resisted incorporation into the Almoravid state were denounced as corrupt innovators whose religious practices had been contaminated by excessive contact with Christian influences. The conquest of Seville in 1091 marked a crucial stage in this process of reunification. The Abadid rulers of Seville had been among the most sophisticated and culturally accomplished of the Taifa dynasties, maintaining a court that rivaled Córdoba in its patronage of poetry, music and architectural projects. However, the military resources proved inadequate to resist Almoravid siege techniques, while their religious practices were condemned by North African clerics as corrupted by un-Islamic innovations. The systematic elimination of Taifa independence created a unified Islamic state that could coordinate resistance to Christian expansion more effectively than the fragmented kingdoms of the previous period. Almoravid administrative practices, developed through experience governing diverse Berber populations in North Africa, proved adaptable to Iberian conditions while maintaining the religious orthodoxy that legitimated North African rule. The appointment of Almoravid governors to replace Taifa rulers ensured unified command while eliminating the political divisions that Christians had previously exploited. The strict interpretation of Islamic law that the Almoravids implemented throughout their Iberian territories represented a dramatic departure from the relatively tolerant practices that had characterized the Taifa period. The new rulers' puritanical approach to religious questions resulted in increased restrictions on Christian and other non-Muslim populations, while Islamic practices that had been influenced by local traditions were suppressed as corrupting innovations. This religious rigour strengthened Islamic identity, but also created new sources of internal tension within Almoravid territories. The architectural and artistic policies of the Almoravid period reflected both the movement's religious conservatism and its substantial material resources. The construction of new mosques and the expansion of existing religious buildings proceeded according to strict guidelines that emphasized functional utility over decorative elaboration. However, the quality of craftsmanship in these projects remained high, while the scale of construction demonstrated the economic prosperity that Almoravid rule had restored to many regions of Al-Andalus. The military innovations that the Almoravids introduced to Iberian warfare included both technological improvements and tactical adaptations that proved highly effective against Christian opponents. The systematic use of crossbows by Berber infantry provided Islamic forces with significant advantages in siege warfare, while improved siege engines enabled the reduction of Christian strongholds that had previously been considered impregnable. The integration of these new military technologies with traditional Berber mobility created combined arms forces of exceptional effectiveness. The economic revival that accompanied Almoravid reunification of Al-Andalus reflected both the elimination of internal warfare and the restoration of trade relationships that had been disrupted during the Taifa period. The North African rulers' control of both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar facilitated commercial exchanges between Iberia and the broader Islamic world, while their military success attracted craftsmen and merchants who had fled during the previous period of political instability. However, the Almoravid system contained inherent contradictions that would ultimately limit its long-term viability in Iberian conditions. The movement's religious ideology emphasized the temporary nature of worldly power and the primary importance of spiritual concerns, creating tensions with the practical requirements of governing complex, ethnically diverse territories. The Berber tribal traditions that provided the foundation of Almoravid military effectiveness were not easily adaptable to the settled agricultural conditions that characterized much of Al-Andalus. The emergence of the Almohad movement in the Atlas Mountains during the 1120s represented a new phase of North African religious reform that would eventually challenge Almoravid authority throughout the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. The Almohads, whose name derived from Al-Muwahhidun, meaning those who proclaim the unity of God, originated as followers of Ibn Tumart, a Berber religious scholar who had studied in the Eastern Islamic world before returning to Morocco with a message of theological and social reform. Ibn Tumart's religious teachings emphasized the absolute unity and transcendence of God in ways that directly challenged Almoravid theological positions. The Almohad founder condemned what he considered the anthropomorphic tendencies in Almoravid religious practice, while his social program called for the elimination of tribal distinctions in favor of a unified Islamic community based purely on religious devotion. These doctrinal innovations provided the ideological foundation for a movement that would ultimately prove more successful than its Almoravid predecessor in creating lasting political institutions. The military organization of the Almohad movement reflected lessons learned from Almoravid successes and failures. Abd al-Mumin, who assumed leadership following Ibn Tumart's death, created a more centralized command structure that reduced the influence of tribal leaders while maintaining the religious motivation that had made Berber warriors so effective in previous campaigns. The Almohad army combined traditional Berber mobility with systematic training programs that produced more disciplined and reliable forces than those available to their predecessors. The Almohad conquest of Almoravid territories proceeded systematically through a series of campaigns that demonstrated superior military organisation and strategic planning. The capture of Marrakesh in 1147 eliminated the centre of Almoravid power in North Africa, while subsequent operations extended Almohad control eastward toward Tunisia and westward toward the Atlantic. The movement's success attracted support from various Berber tribes that had grown dissatisfied with Almoravid rule, providing the manpower necessary for expansion into Iberian territories. The Almohad invasion of Al-Andalus began in 1146, with limited reconnaissance operations designed to test the strength of Almoravid defences and evaluate the potential for local support. These preliminary campaigns revealed that Almoravid authority in Iberia had been weakened by decades of constant warfare against Christian opponents, while the strict religious policies of the North African rulers had created resentment among various segments of the Andalusian population. The systematic conquest of Almoravid territories in southern Iberia proceeded rapidly once Abd al-Mumin committed substantial forces to the peninsula. The Almohad commander's strategy involved the capture of key strongholds that controlled communications between different regions, while his diplomatic agents worked to secure the submission of local commanders through a combination of religious appeals and practical inducements. The fall of Seville in 1147 marked the effective end of Almoravid resistance in western Al-Andalus. The architectural achievements of the Almohad period represented the culmination of Western Islamic building traditions, while introducing innovations that would influence construction throughout the Mediterranean world. The Almohad rulers' patronage of monumental architecture reflected both their substantial resources and their desire to create physical symbols of their religious and political authority. The scale and sophistication of their building projects demonstrated the movement's confidence in its long-term viability as a governing institution. The construction of the Giralda Tower in Seville, begun around 1184, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterised Almohad building programmes. The tower's massive square base supported a minaret that rose to unprecedented heights, creating a landmark visible throughout the Guadalquivir Valley. The building's decorative programme combined traditional Islamic geometric patterns with innovations in brick and tile work that created distinctively Almohad visual effects. The Giralda's architectural significance extended beyond its impressive scale to include important technical innovations in construction methods and structural engineering. The tower's builders employed sophisticated techniques for distributing weight loads that enabled the construction of walls significantly thinner than those required by previous building methods. The integration of decorative and structural elements created aesthetic effects that influenced architectural development throughout the Western Islamic world. The catastrophic defeat of the Almohad forces at Las Novas de Tolosa in 1212 shattered the last unified Islamic resistance to Christian expansion in the peninsula, creating opportunities that the northern kingdoms would exploit with systematic determination over the following half-century. The battle had demonstrated conclusively that the military innovations and religious fervour that had made the North African dynasties so formidable were insufficient against the combined Christian forces, employing improved siege techniques, coordinated cavalry tactics, and the strategic advantages provided by their knowledge of local terrain. The immediate aftermath of Las Navas revealed the extent to which Almohad power had depended on the personal authority of individual commanders rather than institutional structures capable of surviving military disasters. The death of numerous Almohad nobles during the battle eliminated much of the movement's experienced leadership, while the psychological impact of defeat undermined the religious confidence that had sustained North African rule throughout the previous century. Local governors throughout Al-Andalus found themselves isolated from central authority, forced to make independent decisions about resistance or submission to advancing Christian armies. Ferdinand III of Castile inherited this transformed strategic situation when he assumed the throne in 1217, combining the resources of Castile with those of Leon following his mother's death in 1230. The young king possessed both the military experience gained during frontier campaigns and the administrative capabilities necessary to coordinate large-scale conquest operations. His court included veteran commanders who had participated in Las Navas de Tolosa, providing him with detailed knowledge of Islamic military weaknesses and the tactical innovations that had proven most effective against North African forces. The Castilian military machine that Ferdinand assembled for his southern campaigns represented the culmination of 2 centuries of institutional development and tactical refinement. The kingdom's military orders provided disciplined heavy cavalry, whose religious motivation matched their professional competence, while the urban militias of frontier towns contributed infantry forces experienced in siege warfare and familiar with Islamic defensive techniques. The integration of these different military elements under unified royal command created armies capable of sustained operations across extensive territories. Ferdinand's strategic approach to conquest emphasised the systematic reduction of fortified positions rather than the spectacular cavalry charges that had characterised earlier Christian campaigns. His engineers employed sophisticated siege techniques that combined traditional methods with innovations adapted from Islamic military treatises captured during previous campaigns. The use of countermine operations, improved catapults, and coordinated assault tactics enabled Castilian forces to reduce strongholds that had previously been considered impregnable. The Siege of Córdoba, begun in 1236, demonstrated the effectiveness of these new military methods while providing Ferdinand with his most prestigious conquest. The ancient Umayyad capital had maintained its symbolic importance throughout the centuries of Islamic rule, and its capture would represent the definitive reversal of the conquest that had begun at Guadalete 5 centuries earlier. The city's massive walls, built on Roman foundations and strengthened by successive Islamic dynasties, presented formidable obstacles that required months of systematic siege operations. Ferdinand's approach to the Córdoba siege reflected careful planning based on detailed intelligence about the city's defences and supply systems. Castilian forces established fortified camps at strategic points around the city's perimeter, cutting off all routes that might have been used to bring in reinforcements or supplies. The king's engineers constructed elaborate siege works that gradually brought their catapults within range of the city's walls, while mining operations targeted the foundations of key defensive structures. The defenders of Córdoba, led by local commanders whose loyalty to distant Almohad authority had been weakened by years of isolation, initially attempted to maintain traditional defensive strategies based on sorties against the besieging forces and appeals for relief from other Islamic territories. However, the systematic nature of the Castilian siege operations and the obvious impossibility of effective external assistance gradually undermined morale within the city. The civilian population, facing starvation as supplies dwindled, began pressing for negotiations with the Christian forces. The final assault on Córdoba's walls took place in June 1236, following the successful mining of a major tower that created a practicable breach in the city's defences. Castilian forces poured through the gap in disciplined formations, overwhelming the demoralised defenders and securing control of key positions throughout the city. The speed and coordination of this assault demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Christian armies had achieved through decades of frontier warfare experience. Ferdinand's treatment of Córdoba's conquered population reflected both practical political considerations and the religious ideology that motivated Christian expansion. The city's main mosque was immediately consecrated as a cathedral, symbolically reclaiming the religious centre of Islamic Spain for Christianity. However, the king's policies toward the civilian population were relatively moderate, allowing Muslims who accepted Christian rule to remain in their homes, while encouraging voluntary conversion through various incentives rather than forced baptism. The administrative arrangements that Ferdinand established for governing Córdoba became a model for subsequent conquests throughout Andalusia. The city was granted a fuero, or charter, that established legal frameworks for its Christian settlers while defining the rights and obligations of the remaining Muslim population. These legal documents reflected the complex realities of governing territories with mixed religious populations, balancing the demands of Christian colonists with the practical necessity of maintaining agricultural production and commercial activity. The capture of Córdoba opened the entire Guadalquivir Valley to Christian expansion, as the fall of the region's most important fortress eliminated the last significant obstacle to systematic conquest of the surrounding territories. Ferdinand's forces moved rapidly to occupy the network of smaller fortifications that had depended on Córdoba for coordination and support, often encountering only token resistance from demoralized garrisons. The speed of this expansion reflected both superior Christian military organization and the collapse of Islamic defensive coordination following the loss of their regional capital. The systematic colonization of newly conquered territories proceeded according to established Castilian practices that had been refined through generations of frontier expansion. The repartimiento system provided frameworks for distributing lands among Christian settlers while ensuring adequate resources for military defense and administrative functions. Royal officials conducted detailed surveys of conquered territories, cataloguing agricultural resources, urban properties, and defensive installations to facilitate efficient allocation among deserving recipients. The recipients of these land grants included military orders, individual knights who had distinguished themselves during the conquest campaigns, urban communities that had provided military support, and ecclesiastical institutions charged with establishing Christian religious practices in the newly conquered territories. The size and quality of individual allocations reflected both the recipients' contributions to the conquest effort and the strategic importance of their assigned territories for maintaining Christian control. The establishment of new Christian settlements throughout the conquered regions required careful attention to defensive considerations and economic viability. Towns were typically established at strategic locations that controlled important river crossings, mountain passes, or agricultural valleys, with their layouts designed to facilitate defense against potential Islamic counterattacks. The construction of churches, markets, and administrative buildings proceeded rapidly, creating the institutional infrastructure necessary for permanent Christian occupation. Ferdinand's conquest of Seville, completed in 1248 after a siege lasting 16 months, represented the culmination of his military career and the definitive establishment of Christian control over the Guadalquivir Valley. The city's strategic position near the mouth of the river made it crucial for controlling maritime communications between Al-Andalus and North Africa, while its substantial population and commercial importance made its capture essential for consolidating Christian authority throughout the region. The Siege of Seville required innovations in both military technology and logistical organisation that demonstrated the sophistication of mid-13th century Christian warfare. Ferdinand's engineers constructed a bridge of boats across the Guadalquivir River to prevent supplies from reaching the city by water, while his naval forces, supported by ships from the Cantabrian ports, established a blockade that cut off all maritime communications. The coordination of these land and sea operations required unprecedented levels of inter-service cooperation and strategic planning. The city's defenders, led by the Almohad governor Axataf, employed every available method to break the Christian siege, including attempts to destroy the boat bridge, sorties against the besieging camps, and appeals for assistance from Islamic territories in North Africa and Granada. However, the systematic nature of the Christian siege operations and the effective coordination between Castilian land forces and naval units made these defensive efforts increasingly futile as the siege progressed into its second year. The surrender of Seville in November 1248 marked the effective end of significant Islamic resistance in western Andalusia, leaving only the nascent Kingdom of Granada as a substantial Muslim territory in the peninsula. Ferdinand's entry into the conquered city was choreographed as a magnificent demonstration of Christian triumph, with the king processing through streets lined with his victorious troops, while church bells rang from the newly consecrated cathedral that had previously served as the city's main mosque. The transformation of Seville into a Christian city proceeded with the same systematic approach that had characterized Ferdinand's other conquests. The repartimento of the city and its surrounding territories involved extensive surveys and careful allocation of properties among the various groups that had contributed to the conquest. The city's substantial Muslim population was given the choice between conversion to Christianity, emigration to Granada or North Africa, or acceptance of dhimmi-like status under Christian rule. The economic impact of these conquests on the Kingdom of Castile was transformative, providing unprecedented resources for further military expansion and monumental construction projects. The agricultural wealth of the Guadalquivir Valley, combined with the commercial revenues of cities like Cordoba and Seville, enabled Ferdinand to maintain larger armies for longer periods while supporting the religious and educational institutions that legitimized Christian rule. The influx of tribute payments from the surviving Islamic territories provided additional resources for continued expansion. Simultaneously, the Crown of Aragon under James I was pursuing its own systematic expansion into Islamic territories along the Mediterranean coast and the Balearic Islands. The Aragonese approach to conquest differed from Castilian methods in several important respects, reflecting both the distinct institutional traditions of the Eastern Kingdom and the different strategic challenges presented by island and coastal warfare. The Aragonese military system placed greater emphasis on naval operations and amphibious assault techniques, while their administrative practices showed greater continuity with earlier Islamic governmental structures. James VI's conquest of Majorca, completed between 1229 and 1235, demonstrated the effectiveness of Aragonese naval warfare and the kingdom's capacity for sustained overseas operations. The island's strategic position in the western Mediterranean made its conquest essential for Aragonese control of maritime trade routes, while its substantial agricultural resources and urban centres provided economic incentives that justified the considerable expenses involved in amphibious warfare. The planning for the Majorcan expedition reflected careful consideration of the logistical challenges involved in transporting large armies across open water and maintaining them on hostile territory. James assembled a fleet of over 100 vessels, including both royal ships and vessels contributed by the maritime communities of Catalonia and Valencia. The army that embarked for Majorca included approximately 15,000 troops, representing the largest overseas expedition that Aragon had ever attempted. The landing at Santa Ponca in September 1229 proceeded according to carefully rehearsed plans that minimised the vulnerabilities inherent in amphibious operations. Aragonese forces established a secure beachhead before advancing inland toward the island's capital at Medina Mallorca, employing tactics that combine the mobility advantages of cavalry with the defensive capabilities of infantry formations equipped with crossbows and other missile weapons. The siege of Medina Mallorca required adaptations of traditional siege techniques to the specific conditions of island warfare, where the defenders could not expect relief from external forces but possessed substantial resources accumulated through generations of maritime commerce. James's engineers employed innovative approaches to siege warfare that maximised the effectiveness of their limited heavy equipment while exploiting the psychological advantages that their successful landing had provided. The fall of Majorca's capital in December 1229 was followed by systematic campaigns to reduce the remaining Islamic strongholds throughout the island. These operations demonstrated the effectiveness of combined land and naval forces in eliminating isolated pockets of resistance, while the establishment of Christian administrative structures proceeded rapidly in areas under Aragonese control. The island's Muslim population faced similar choices to those offered in Castilian conquests, with many choosing emigration rather than submission to Christian rule. The conquest of the remaining Balearic Islands proceeded systematically over the following years, with Minorca submitting to Aragonese authority in 1232 and Ibiza falling in 1235. These operations required less extensive military efforts than the Majorcan campaign, as the demonstration of Aragonese naval supremacy and the systematic approach to conquest had undermined Islamic resistance throughout the island chain. The completion of these conquests provided Aragon with secure bases for further expansion along the Mediterranean coast. James VI's subsequent conquest of the Kingdom of Valencia, completed in 1238, represented the most significant territorial expansion in Aragonese history and fundamentally altered the balance of power along the eastern coast of Iberia. The Valencian territories included some of the most fertile agricultural land in the peninsula, along with important commercial centres that controlled trade routes connecting the interior with Mediterranean markets. The systematic nature of this conquest demonstrated the institutional maturity that the Crown of Aragon had achieved by the mid-13th century. The siege of Valencia city itself required extensive preparations and innovative siege techniques, adapted to the specific challenges presented by the city's location and fortifications. James's forces employed systematic approaches to reducing the city's defences while maintaining supply lines that extended back to Aragonese territories in Catalonia. The coordination of these complex operations demonstrated the administrative sophistication that enabled the Crown of Aragon to conduct sustained military campaigns across extensive territories. The establishment of Christian rule throughout these newly conquered territories required administrative innovations that could accommodate the complex ethnic and religious diversity that characterized the conquered populations. The fueros granted to Christian settlers provided legal frameworks that encouraged colonization while maintaining the social order necessary for continued agricultural and commercial productivity. These legal arrangements reflected both practical considerations and the ideological commitments that motivated Christian expansion. The survival of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada as the last significant Islamic territory in the peninsula resulted from a combination of geographical advantages, diplomatic skill, and the strategic priorities of the Christian kingdoms. The mountainous terrain of the Granada region provided natural defensive advantages that made conquest significantly more difficult and expensive than the relatively open territories of the Guadalquivir Valley. The Nasrid rulers' willingness to accept tributary status and provide military assistance to Christian campaigns against other Islamic territories enabled them to maintain independence while their neighbours succumbed to Christian expansion. Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasser, who established the Nasrid dynasty in 1238, demonstrated remarkable political acumen in navigating the complex diplomatic environment created by rapid Christian expansion. His acceptance of tributary status under Ferdinand III provided immediate security against Castilian attack, while allowing him to consolidate control over the remaining Islamic territories in southeastern Iberia. This pragmatic approach to survival would enable the Nasrid kingdom to persist for another 2.5 centuries, becoming the last Islamic state in Western Europe. The dynastic union that joined the Kingdom of Aragon with the County of Barcelona in 1137 emerged from the calculated political manoeuvring of Ramiro II of Aragon, whose desperate circumstances following his brother Alfonso the Battler's death, without legitimate heirs, forced him to abandon his monastic vows and secure the kingdom's succession through matrimonial alliance. The marriage contract between his infant daughter Petronilla and Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona created a composite monarchy that would fundamentally transform the political landscape of eastern Iberia while establishing the foundation for one of medieval Europe's most successful maritime empires. Ramon Berenguer IV's assumption of the title Prince of Aragon, while retaining his position as Count of Barcelona, reflected the complex constitutional arrangements that governed this unprecedented union. The Catalan nobleman brought to the partnership not only his county's substantial military resources and commercial networks, but also a sophisticated administrative tradition that had been developed through generations of frontier warfare and Mediterranean trade. His court at Barcelona included experienced diplomats, skilled military engineers, and knowledgeable merchants whose expertise would prove crucial in the expanded territories that the Union would eventually control. The institutional structures that emerged from this dynastic combination preserved the distinct legal and administrative traditions of both constituent territories, while creating mechanisms for coordinated action in matters of common interest. The Aragonese Cortes maintained its traditional role in approving taxation and confirming royal legislation, while the Catalan courts continued to represent the interests of Barcelona's merchant communities and noble families. This constitutional pluralism, rather than creating administrative confusion, provided the flexibility necessary to govern territories with fundamentally different economic structures and political traditions. The military campaigns that established the new crown's territorial expansion began with the systematic conquest of Islamic strongholds along the Ebro River Valley, where the fragmentation of Almohad authority following Las Navas de Tolosa created opportunities for coordinated Christian advance. The Siege of Tortosa in 1148 demonstrated the effectiveness of combining Aragonese cavalry with Catalan siege expertise, while the participation of Genoese naval forces illustrated the international connections that Barcelona's commercial networks could mobilise for military purposes. The capture of Lleida in 1149 completed the crown's control over the strategic river valleys that connected the Pyrenean passes with the Mediterranean coast, providing secure communications between the Aragonese heartland and Catalonia's commercial centres. These conquests required extensive siege operations that employed innovative engineering techniques, including the construction of elaborate wooden towers that enabled attacking forces to surmount the massive stone walls that protected these Islamic strongholds. The coordination of these complex operations demonstrated the administrative sophistication that distinguished the Crown of Aragon from its Castilian rivals. The development of representative institutions within the Crown of Aragon reflected both the practical necessities of governing diverse territories and the constitutional traditions that had been inherited from earlier periods. The Cortes of Aragon evolved into a sophisticated legislative body that included representatives from the nobility, clergy, and urban communities, while similar assemblies in Catalonia and Valencia provided mechanisms for local participation in royal government. These institutions possessed significant powers over taxation and legislation that constrained royal authority while ensuring that local interests received adequate representation in policy formation. The office of the Justicia of Aragon emerged as one of the most distinctive constitutional innovations of the medieval period, providing institutional protection for individual rights against arbitrary royal action. The Justicia served as a permanent judicial official whose authority derived directly from the Cortes rather than royal appointment, enabling him to investigate complaints against royal administrators and provide legal remedies for subjects who believed their traditional privileges had been violated. This institutional arrangement created a system of constitutional monarchy that was unique in medieval Europe. The legal framework established by the Fueros of Aragon codified these constitutional limitations on royal power while preserving the traditional rights and privileges of different social groups within the kingdom. These legal codes, which were regularly updated and expanded by successive Cortes, established detailed procedures for taxation, military service, and judicial proceedings that prevented arbitrary royal action, while maintaining the social hierarchy that supported the kingdom's military effectiveness. The Fueros provisions regarding individual liberty and property rights influenced constitutional development throughout medieval Europe. The economic foundations of the Crown's expanding power rested on Catalonia's participation in the Mediterranean commercial revolution that transformed European trade during the 12th and 13th centuries. Barcelona's merchants established trading posts throughout the western Mediterranean, creating commercial networks that extended from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. These commercial relationships provided not only substantial revenues through customs duties and trading profits, but also the intelligence networks and diplomatic connections that supported the Crown's territorial expansion. The development of maritime law codes particularly the Consular de Mer, reflected Barcelona's leadership in Mediterranean commerce and provided legal frameworks that facilitated international trade. These legal innovations addressed practical problems of maritime commerce, including insurance arrangements, partnership agreements, and dispute resolution mechanisms that enabled merchants to conduct business across vast distances with acceptable levels of risk. The widespread adoption of these legal codes throughout the Mediterranean demonstrated Catalonia's commercial influence and provided additional sources of revenue through licensing fees and judicial proceedings. The conquest of Sicily in 1282 marked the Crown of Aragon's emergence as a major Mediterranean power, capable of challenging the established dominance of French and papal interests in Italian affairs. The Sicilian Vespers uprising against Charles of Anjou's harsh rule provided Peter III of Aragon with the opportunity to press his wife's hereditary claims to the island, but the military campaigns that followed required unprecedented commitments of men and resources that tested the Crown's institutional capabilities to their limits. The naval operations that enabled Aragonese forces to reach Sicily and maintain communications with their Italian territories demonstrated the maritime expertise that Catalan shipbuilders and navigators had developed through generations of Mediterranean commerce. The Aragonese fleet employed innovative galley designs that combined the speed and manoeuvrability necessary for military operations with the cargo capacity required for sustained logistical support. These vessels, constructed in the shipyards of Barcelona and Valencia, incorporated technical improvements that made them superior to most contemporary warships. The Battle of the Gulf of Naples in 1284 established Aragonese naval supremacy in the western Mediterranean, while eliminating the Angevin fleet that had threatened communications between Sicily and the Crown's Iberian territories. The engagement demonstrated sophisticated naval tactics that combined traditional ramming techniques with innovative uses of crossbow fire and Greek fire projectors. The coordination of multiple galley squadrons in complex manoeuvres required navigation skills and command capabilities that reflected the professional competence of Aragonese naval commanders. The administrative arrangements established for governing Sicily reflected the Crown of Aragon's constitutional traditions, while accommodating the island's distinct legal and cultural heritage. The Sicilian Parliament retained significant powers over taxation and legislation, while local nobles preserved their traditional privileges and jurisdictions. This flexible approach to imperial governance enabled the Crown to maintain effective control over distant territories without provoking the type of resistance movements that had undermined other medieval attempts at overseas expansion. The conquest of Sardinia in 1297 proceeded according to a papal grant that provided legal justification for Aragonese expansion while resolving diplomatic conflicts with other Mediterranean powers. The island's strategic position between Catalonia and Sicily made its control essential for maintaining secure communications within the Crown's expanding maritime empire, while its agricultural resources and mineral wealth provided additional economic incentives for conquest. The military campaigns required to establish effective control over the island's mountainous interior demonstrated the adaptability of Aragonese military organisation to diverse geographical conditions. The Catalan Company's extraordinary expedition to the eastern Mediterranean between 1302 and 1311 represented one of the most remarkable military adventures of the medieval period, establishing temporary Aragonese control over territories in Greece while demonstrating the Crown's capacity for overseas operations on an unprecedented scale. The company, originally recruited for service in Sicily, consisted of approximately 6,000 experienced soldiers whose military effectiveness had been proven in the Italian campaigns of the previous decades. Roger de Flore's leadership of this mercenary force reflected the international character of medieval military service, as this German-born commander had gained his military experience in various Mediterranean conflicts before entering Aragonese service. His negotiations with the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II for employment against Turkish forces in Anatolia demonstrated the diplomatic sophistication that characterized the Crown of Aragon's international relationships, while the company's subsequent operations revealed both the potential and limitations of mercenary warfare in distant territories. The company's initial campaigns in Anatolia achieved remarkable success against Turkish forces that had been advancing steadily into Byzantine territories for several decades. The Catalan soldiers' combination of heavy cavalry, crossbow-armed infantry, and innovative siege techniques proved highly effective against opponents who had grown accustomed to Byzantine military weakness. The recovery of several important fortresses and the stabilisation of the frontier demonstrated that well-organised Western military forces could still achieve significant results in the Eastern Mediterranean. The assassination of Roger de Flor in 1305 during negotiations at Adrianople precipitated a crisis that transformed the company from Byzantine allies into independent conquerors pursuing their own territorial ambitions. The Catalans' subsequent campaigns of revenge against Byzantine territories revealed the destructive potential of uncontrolled mercenary forces. While their eventual establishment of the duchies of Athens and Neopatria demonstrated their capacity for creating lasting political institutions even in hostile environments. The cultural achievements of the Crown of Aragon during this period reflected both the material prosperity generated by territorial expansion and the intellectual sophistication that characterized court life in Barcelona and other major cities. The patronage provided by successive rulers supported literary and scholarly activities that produced works of lasting significance, while the international connections maintained through diplomatic and commercial relationships facilitated cultural exchanges that enriched Aragonese intellectual life. Ramon Lull's extraordinary intellectual career exemplified the cultural flowering that characterized the Crown of Aragon during the 13th and early 14th centuries. Born into a noble Majorcan family following the island's conquest by James I, Lull received an education that combined traditional Christian learning with exposure to Islamic and Hebrew philosophical traditions that remained influential in the newly conquered territories. His conversion from courtly life to religious devotion around 1263 marked the beginning of a scholarly career that would produce over 200 works on subjects ranging from theology and philosophy to literature and the natural sciences. Lull's development of the Ars Magna represented one of the most innovative intellectual achievements of the medieval period, combining logical analysis with mystical insight in ways that influenced both scholastic philosophy and later scientific methodology. His systematic approach to knowledge organization and his attempts to create universal languages for scholarly communication reflected the international perspective that characterized intellectual life within the Crown of Aragon's diverse territories. The mechanical devices he designed to facilitate logical reasoning anticipated later developments in computational thinking by several centuries. The missionary activities that occupied much of Lull's later career demonstrated the Crown's commitment to religious expansion alongside territorial conquest. His repeated journeys to North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, undertaken despite considerable personal danger, reflected both individual religious devotion and broader political strategies designed to extend Christian influence throughout the Mediterranean world. His martyrdom in Tunisia around 1315 provided the Crown with a powerful symbol of religious dedication that enhanced its reputation throughout Christian Europe. The literary renaissance that flourished in Catalonia during the 14th century produced works that established the vernacular language as a medium for sophisticated artistic expression, while celebrating the Crown's military and political achievements. The Chronica of James I, written in Catalan rather than Latin, represented a conscious decision to employ the vernacular for historical writing that reflected growing confidence in local cultural traditions. The Chronicle's detailed accounts of the king's conquests provided both historical records and literary models that influenced subsequent historical writing throughout the Crown's territories. Bennett's close continuation of this historical tradition in his Chronicle of Peter III's reign demonstrated the maturation of Catalan historical writing and its capacity for analysing complex political and military developments. His accounts of the Sicilian campaigns and the diplomatic negotiations that accompanied them provided detailed insights into the decision-making processes that guided the crown's expansion, while celebrating the military virtues that had enabled these achievements. The chronicle's sophisticated analysis of causation and its attention to psychological motivation reflected intellectual approaches that anticipated later developments in historical methodology. The poetry of Ausias March, writing in the early 15th century, represented the culmination of Catalan literary achievement during this period, while reflecting the cultural sophistication that characterised court life throughout the crown's territories. His innovative approaches to lyric expression and his psychological analysis of human emotion established new standards for vernacular poetry that influenced literary development throughout the Western Mediterranean. The international recognition that his work received demonstrated the cultural prestige that the Crown of Aragon had achieved through its political and military successes. The economic transformations that accompanied the Crown's territorial expansion created new forms of commercial organisation and financial innovation that influenced economic development throughout medieval Europe. The emergence of Barcelona as a major banking centre reflected both the capital accumulation generated by Mediterranean trade and the sophisticated financial techniques that Catalan merchants had developed to support long-distance commerce. These innovations included early forms of marine insurance, letters of credit and partnership arrangements that facilitated international business relationships. The Taula de Canvi, established in Barcelona in 1401, represented one of Europe's first public banks and demonstrated the Crown's commitment to supporting commercial development through institutional innovation. This institution provided secure deposit facilities for merchants while offering credit services that facilitated both local and international trade. The bank's operations were regulated by detailed statutes that established standards for financial practice while protecting depositors' interests through municipal guarantees. The agricultural improvements implemented throughout the Crown's territories reflected both population growth and technological innovation that increased productivity while supporting larger urban populations. The expansion of irrigation systems in Valencia and Sicily employed engineering techniques that had been adapted from Islamic models, while incorporating innovations that improved efficiency and reliability. These hydraulic works enabled the cultivation of new crops that diversified agricultural production, while providing additional sources of royal revenue through taxation. The development of textile manufacturing in Catalonia and Valencia created industries that supplied both local markets and export trade throughout the Mediterranean. The production of high-quality woolens and silk fabrics employed techniques that had been learned from Islamic craftsmen, while incorporating innovations that improved both quality and efficiency. These industries provided employment for substantial urban populations while generating the export revenues that supported the Crown's military and diplomatic activities. The death of Alfonso IX of Leon in 1230 created the political circumstances that would transform the balance of power in medieval Iberia, as his son Ferdinand III inherited both the Leonese crown and his Castilian patrimony, uniting under a single ruler the two most powerful Christian kingdoms of the peninsula. This dynastic accident eliminated the fratricidal conflicts that had weakened both realms during the previous century, while concentrating military and economic resources sufficient to sustain the massive territorial conquests that would reduce Islamic Al-Andalus to the single tributary kingdom of Granada. Ferdinand's approach to governing his expanded domains reflected both practical necessity and deliberate policy choices designed to prevent the type of administrative fragmentation that had previously weakened Christian expansion efforts. Rather than maintaining separate governmental structures for Leon and Castile, the new monarch systematically integrated their military commands, fiscal systems, and judicial institutions under unified royal authority. This consolidation process required careful negotiation with noble families whose traditional privileges and territorial jurisdictions had developed during centuries of independent existence. But Ferdinand's diplomatic skill and military success provided sufficient leverage to overcome most resistance to administrative reform. The Leonese nobility's acceptance of Castilian hegemony was facilitated by their recognition that unified command had enabled Ferdinand's spectacular conquests of Cordoba, Seville, and other major Islamic strongholds that had resisted Christian assault for centuries. The distribution of conquered territories among supporters from both kingdoms created new sources of wealth and status that compensated for any loss of traditional autonomy, while the continuing threat from Granada provided compelling reasons for maintaining military cooperation under royal leadership. The administrative structures that emerged from this unification process established precedents for centralised monarchy that would influence Castilian governmental development for centuries. The royal chancery expanded its operations to handle the increased volume of legal documents, territorial grants, and diplomatic correspondence required to govern the enlarged kingdom, while specialised departments developed expertise in managing conquered territories with substantial Muslim populations. These bureaucratic innovations created career opportunities for educated men from lesser noble families, gradually expanding the social base of royal administration beyond the traditional great magnate families. The military organisation of the unified kingdom reflected both the expanded territorial responsibilities and the continuing need for frontier defence against Granada and potential North African intervention. The traditional system of feudal military service was supplemented by paid professional forces whose loyalty to the crown was not mediated by local noble commanders, while the military orders continued to provide disciplined heavy cavalry for major campaigns. The integration of urban militias from recently conquered cities added experienced infantry forces familiar with Islamic military techniques and siege warfare. The economic foundations of Castilian expansion rested on the agricultural wealth of the Duero and Guadalquivir valleys, whose fertile soils supported both subsistence farming and commercial crop production that generated substantial royal revenues through taxation. The conquest of Seville had provided access to Mediterranean trade networks that connected Castilian territories with North African and Eastern Mediterranean markets, while the tribute payments from Granada supplied additional resources for military and administrative expenses. This economic prosperity enabled the crown to maintain larger armies for longer periods, while supporting the religious and cultural institutions that legitimised Christian rule over conquered populations. The establishment of the Mesta in 1273 under Alfonso X represented one of the most significant economic innovations of the medieval period, creating an institutional framework for managing the seasonal migration of sheep flocks between summer pastures in the northern mountains and winter grazing areas in the southern plains. This organisation emerged from practical necessity, as the conquest of Andalusia had opened vast territories suitable for pastoral agriculture, while the depopulation caused by warfare and emigration had left extensive areas unavailable for intensive cultivation. The Mesta's organisational structure reflected the diverse interests involved in transhuman pastoralism, including great noble families who owned enormous flocks, monastic institutions with substantial pastoral holdings, urban investors who financed livestock operations, and the countless smallholders whose few animals participated in the seasonal migrations. The Brotherhood's regulations established detailed procedures for organising the twice-yearly movements, resolving disputes between herders and farmers over grazing rights and crop damage, and maintaining the network of drove roads that connected distant pastures. The economic importance of wool exports to northern Europe transformed Castile from a primarily agricultural kingdom into a major participant in international commerce, with Burgos emerging as one of Europe's most important commercial centres. Castilian wool, particularly the fine fleeces produced by merino sheep, commanded premium prices in the textile centres of Flanders and England, where skilled craftsmen transformed the raw material into luxury fabrics that were sold throughout the continent. The profits from this trade provided the crown with substantial customs revenues, while creating a powerful merchant class with interests in maintaining political stability and commercial privileges. The canadas or drove roads that connected the seasonal pastures became arteries of economic activity that linked remote rural areas with major commercial centres. These routes, some extending for hundreds of kilometres across difficult terrain, required constant maintenance and protection from bandits and local officials who might attempt to impose unauthorised tolls or restrictions. The Mesta's privileges included the right to use these traditional routes without interference, to graze animals on common lands and stubble fields, and to purchase supplies at regulated prices in towns along the migration routes. The social and political influence of the Mesta extended far beyond its immediate economic functions, as the organisation's members included some of the most powerful noble families in Castile, along with important ecclesiastical institutions and wealthy urban merchants. The Brotherhood's annual assemblies provided forums for discussing not only pastoral matters, but also broader political issues affecting the kingdom, while its financial resources enabled it to influence royal policy through loans and political support. This concentration of economic power in pastoral agriculture would have profound consequences for Castilian social development, as it encouraged the maintenance of extensive underpopulated territories devoted to livestock rather than intensive agricultural settlement. The reign of Alfonso the Learnedale marked both the intellectual zenith of medieval Castile and the beginning of the political instability that would plague the kingdom for the next 2 centuries. Alfonso's scholarly interests and ambitious cultural projects created a court that attracted learned men from throughout Europe and the Islamic world, while his legal and administrative reforms established institutional frameworks that would influence Spanish governmental development for centuries. However, his expensive imperial ambitions and controversial domestic policies provoked noble rebellions that weakened royal authority and established precedents for aristocratic resistance to monarchical power. The Siete Partidas, Alfonso's comprehensive legal code, represented one of the most sophisticated attempts at systematic jurisprudence in medieval Europe, combining Roman law principles with Germanic customary practices and canon law provisions to create a unified legal framework for governing Castile's diverse territories and populations. The code's detailed provisions addressed everything from royal prerogatives and noble privileges to commercial regulations and family law, establishing legal principles that would influence Spanish jurisprudence into the modern period. Alfonso's historical and literary projects, including the Historia de España and the Grande e General Historia, demonstrated the cultural ambitions that characterized his reign, while establishing vernacular Castilian as a language suitable for scholarly and artistic expression. These works employed teams of translators and scholars working with Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew sources to create comprehensive accounts of world history and Spanish development that reflected the international perspective of Alfonso's court. The astronomical treatises produced under royal patronage, particularly the Alphonsine tables, achieved international recognition and influenced scientific development throughout Europe. The imperial ambitions that consumed much of Alfonso's attention and resources reflected both personal dynastic claims and broader strategic considerations about Castile's role in European politics. His pursuit of the Holy Roman Empire crown based on his mother's Hohenstaufen lineage required enormous expenditures on diplomatic missions, military preparations, and political bribes that strained the kingdom's finances while producing no tangible benefits for Castilian interests. The failure of these imperial projects damaged royal prestige while providing ammunition for domestic opponents who criticised the king's neglect of peninsular affairs. The noble rebellion that erupted in 1272 under the leadership of Alfonso's brother, Infante Felipe, revealed the extent to which aristocratic opposition had been building during the king's preoccupation with imperial ambitions. The rebels' grievances included excessive taxation to fund foreign adventures, the appointment of foreign advisors to important positions, and the king's attempts to limit traditional noble privileges through legal and administrative reforms. The rebellion's initial success demonstrated the military resources that great noble families could mobilise when united in opposition to royal authority. The civil war that followed lasted intermittently for over a decade, devastating large areas of Castile while encouraging external intervention from Aragon, France and Granada. The conflict's destructive effects on agricultural production, commercial activity and administrative functions weakened the kingdom's capacity for external expansion, while creating precedents for noble resistance that would influence Castilian politics for generations. The eventual reconciliation between Alfonso and his opponents required significant concessions to aristocratic privileges that limited royal authority and established the principle that monarchical power was constrained by noble consent. The succession crisis that followed Alfonso's death in 1284 precipitated an even more serious conflict between his son Sancho IV and the supporters of the Infantes de la Cerda, whose claims were based on their status as sons of Alfonso's deceased eldest son Ferdinand. This dispute involved fundamental questions about succession law and the nature of royal authority that had implications extending far beyond the immediate dynastic conflict. The supporters of the Infantes argued for strict primogeniture that would have elevated the eldest son's children over their uncle, while Sancho's party maintained that the kingdom's needs required an adult ruler capable of immediate effective governance. The international dimensions of this succession dispute reflected Castile's growing importance in European politics and the extent to which domestic conflicts could attract foreign intervention. The French monarchy supported the Infantes' claims as part of broader strategies to limit Castilian power and extend French influence in Iberian affairs, while Aragon alternately supported different factions depending on immediate strategic calculations. The involvement of these external powers prolonged the conflict while increasing its destructive effects on Castilian society and economy. Sancho IV's eventual victory in this succession struggle was achieved through military success, diplomatic skill, and his ability to present himself as the candidate best qualified to defend Castilian interests against both domestic and foreign threats. His coronation in 1284 established important precedents about the relationship between royal authority and noble consent, as his legitimacy depended not only on hereditary claims, but also on recognition by the kingdom's most powerful families. This contractual aspect of monarchy would become increasingly important in subsequent reigns, as nobles demanded greater participation in governmental decisions. The minority of Ferdinand IV, who inherited the throne at age 9 in 1295, created another extended period of political instability as competing factions struggled for control of royal authority. This regency arrangements established by Sancho IV's testament were immediately challenged by various noble coalitions seeking to advance their own interests, while external powers again attempted to exploit Castilian weakness for territorial and political advantage. The young king's mother, Maria de Molina, demonstrated remarkable political skill in navigating these treacherous circumstances, but her efforts could not prevent the fragmentation of royal authority that characterized this period. The emergence of powerful noble leagues during Ferdinand's minority represented a fundamental challenge to monarchical authority that would influence Castilian politics throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. These aristocratic confederations combined military resources from multiple families to create forces capable of challenging royal armies, while their political programs demanded significant limitations on monarchical power and greater noble participation in governmental decisions. The League's ability to coordinate their activities across extensive territories demonstrated the organisational sophistication that the high nobility had developed during previous conflicts. The Hermandades or urban leagues that emerged in response to noble violence represented attempts by town governments and merchant communities to protect their interests through collective action when royal authority proved inadequate. These municipal confederations organised their own military forces, established judicial procedures for resolving commercial disputes, and negotiated directly with noble factions to secure protection for trade routes and market activities. The success of these urban leagues demonstrated the economic importance of commercial activities and the political influence that wealthy merchant communities could exercise when properly organised. The Battle of the Vega de Granada in 1319 where both Ferdinand IV and his uncle Infante Peter were killed during a campaign against the Nasrid kingdom, precipitated another succession crisis that further weakened royal authority. The death of the king without adult heirs meant that the crown passed to his infant son Alfonso VII, creating another extended minority that provided opportunities for noble factions to advance their territorial and political ambitions. The regency struggles that followed demonstrated the inability of existing institutional arrangements to provide stable governance during royal minorities. Alfonso V's assumption of personal rule in 1325 marked the beginning of a systematic effort to restore royal authority and eliminate the noble privileges that had accumulated during previous decades of political instability. The young king's military campaigns against rebellious nobles employed innovative tactical approaches that combined traditional heavy cavalry with crossbow-armed infantry and early gunpowder weapons, while his administrative reforms sought to establish more effective royal control over taxation, justice, and military organisation. These centralising policies provoked fierce resistance from entrenched noble interests, but ultimately succeeded in restoring effective monarchical government. The victory over the combined forces of Granada and the Marinid dynasty at the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340 represented the culmination of Alfonso's military reforms and demonstrated that unified Castilian forces could still achieve decisive victories against Islamic opponents. The battle's strategic significance extended beyond its immediate military results, as it eliminated the last serious threat of North African intervention in Iberian affairs while confirming Castilian hegemony over the peninsula's remaining Islamic territories. The victory's psychological impact strengthened royal prestige, while providing resources for continued administrative and military development. The Black Death's arrival in Castile during 1348 to 1349 created demographic and economic disruptions that fundamentally altered the kingdom's social structure while providing new challenges for royal authority. The massive population losses, which may have eliminated 1/3 or more of the kingdom's inhabitants, disrupted agricultural production, reduced tax revenues, and created labour shortages that empowered surviving peasants to demand better working conditions and higher wages. These economic changes weakened the traditional social hierarchy while creating new opportunities for social mobility that challenged established patterns of authority. The reign of Peter III, who succeeded Alfonso Juan in 1350, became synonymous with the violent factional conflicts that characterised late medieval Castile. Peter's attempts to maintain royal authority through harsh measures against noble opponents earned him the epithet the Cruel from his enemies, while his supporters praised his efforts to enforce justice and protect royal prerogatives against aristocratic usurpation. The civil wars that consumed his reign reflected deeper structural problems in Castilian society that could not be resolved through traditional governmental mechanisms. The Trastamara revolution that brought Henry II to the throne in 1369 represented both a dynastic change and a fundamental shift in the balance of power between monarchy and nobility. Henry's victory over his half-brother Peter was achieved through extensive noble support that required significant concessions to aristocratic privileges and territorial ambitions. The new dynasty's legitimacy depended on maintaining these aristocratic alliances, creating a political system in which royal authority was effectively constrained by noble consent and participation in governmental decisions. The succession crisis that erupted upon Henry IV's death in December 1474 represented the culmination of decades of Castilian political instability, pitting Isabella of Castile against her half-niece Juana la Beltraneja, in a conflict that would determine not only the kingdom's immediate future, but the entire trajectory of Spanish development. Isabella's supporters questioned the legitimacy of Juana's birth, claiming she was the daughter of Beltran de la Cueva rather than Henry IV, while Juana's faction maintained that she was the rightful heir according to established succession laws. This dynastic dispute quickly escalated into a comprehensive civil war that drew in Portugal, France and Aragon as external powers sought to influence the outcome according to their strategic interests. Isabella's marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 had been conducted in secret to avoid Henry IV's opposition, but it now provided the crucial alliance that would enable her victory in the succession struggle. The union brought together the military resources of both kingdoms while creating the possibility of eventual political unification under their joint rule. Ferdinand's experience in Aragonese politics and his proven military capabilities complemented Isabella's determination and political acumen, creating a formidable partnership that could coordinate resources across multiple theatres of conflict. The military campaigns that secured Isabella's throne demonstrated the tactical innovations that had been developing in Castilian warfare during the previous century. The royal forces employed professional infantry armed with crossbows and early firearms, supported by artillery pieces that could reduce fortified positions with unprecedented effectiveness. The Siege of Zamora in 1476 showcased these new military technologies, as Ferdinand's engineers employed cannon to breach walls that had previously been considered impregnable, while disciplined infantry formations prevented the defenders from conducting the type of sorties that had traditionally been used to disrupt siege operations. The Battle of Toro in March 1476 proved decisive in establishing the military superiority that would ultimately secure Isabella's recognition as legitimate queen. The engagement took place on a broad plain that allowed both armies to deploy their cavalry effectively, but the outcome was determined by the superior discipline and coordination of the Isabellan forces rather than individual heroism or tactical brilliance. Ferdinand's personal leadership during the crucial phases of the battle inspired his troops while demonstrating the military competence that had made him one of Europe's most respected commanders. The political settlement that followed Isabella's military victory required careful negotiation of the constitutional arrangements that would govern the joint rule of Castile and Aragon. The motto, Tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, expressed the theoretical equality of both monarchs, but the practical implementation of this principle required detailed agreements about the exercise of authority in different territories and circumstances. These arrangements preserved the distinct legal and administrative traditions of both kingdoms, while creating mechanisms for coordinated action in matters of common interest. The administrative reforms that the Catholic monarchs implemented throughout their territories reflected both practical necessity and deliberate policy choices designed to strengthen royal authority while improving governmental efficiency. The establishment of the Royal Council as the supreme administrative body created institutional mechanisms for coordinating policy across different kingdoms and territories, while specialised councils for military affairs, finance and justice provided expertise in managing complex governmental functions. These bureaucratic innovations attracted educated men from lesser noble families and urban backgrounds, gradually expanding the social base of royal administration beyond traditional aristocratic networks. The pacification of Castilian nobility represented one of the monarch's most significant domestic achievements, as they systematically eliminated the private warfare and territorial usurpation that had characterized previous reigns. The destruction of numerous illegal castles built during the civil wars of the 15th century demonstrated royal determination to monopolize military force, while the incorporation of great noble families into court service provided alternative sources of status and income that reduced their incentives for rebellion. The establishment of the Santa Hermandad as a royal police force enabled the crown to maintain order in rural areas where traditional feudal authorities had proven inadequate. The conquest of Granada, begun in earnest in 1482, represented both the culmination of centuries of Christian expansion and a demonstration of the military and administrative capabilities that the unified monarchy had developed. The campaign's systematic character distinguished it from earlier frontier warfare, as the Catholic monarchs employed coordinated strategies that combined siege warfare, naval blockade, and diplomatic pressure to gradually reduce Nasrid resistance. The construction of the fortified city of Santa Fe during the Siege of Granada demonstrated the monarch's commitment to sustained operations, while the coordination of forces from throughout their territories showed the organisational sophistication that unified command had made possible. The siege operations that characterised the Granada campaign employed the most advanced military technology available in late 15th century Europe. The Royal Artillery train included bronze cannon capable of breaching medieval fortifications, while the Engineering Corps constructed elaborate siege works that gradually tightened the noose around defended positions. The Siege of Malaga in 1487 demonstrated these capabilities. A sustained bombardment reduced the city's walls to rubble, while preventing the defenders from receiving supplies or reinforcements from other Nasrid territories. The fall of Granada in January 1492 was choreographed as a magnificent demonstration of Christian triumph, with Boabdil's surrender ceremony emphasising the definitive end of Islamic political power in Iberia. The capitulations of Granada established the terms under which the city's Muslim population would be incorporated into the Christian kingdom, initially promising religious tolerance and the preservation of traditional customs. However, these agreements would soon be modified as the monarch's policies evolved toward religious uniformity throughout their territories. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 reflected the monarch's determination to ensure religious orthodoxy throughout their territories while strengthening royal control over ecclesiastical affairs. The institution's creation required papal authorization, but its organization and operations remained under royal rather than papal control, providing the crown with powerful instruments for enforcing religious conformity and eliminating potential sources of political opposition. The appointment of Thomas de Torquemada as Grand Inquisitor established centralized direction for inquisitorial activities throughout Castile and Aragon. The Inquisition's procedures reflected both medieval legal traditions and innovations designed to address the specific challenges of identifying and prosecuting religious heterodoxy. The use of secret testimony and the presumption of guilt in cases involving heretical beliefs created judicial processes that differed significantly from traditional criminal proceedings, while the confiscation of condemned prisoners' property provided financial incentives that supported the institution's operations. The auto de fe ceremonies that publicly proclaimed the Inquisition's judgments served both judicial and propaganda functions, demonstrating the consequences of religious nonconformity while reinforcing Orthodox Catholic identity. The expulsion of unconverted populations, beginning with the edict against those practicing Judaism in 1492, represented the logical culmination of policies designed to create religious uniformity throughout the Spanish kingdoms. The edict's terms required immediate conversion to Christianity or departure from Spanish territories within 4 months, effectively eliminating centuries-old communities that had contributed significantly to the kingdom's economic and intellectual development. Similar measures would later be applied to Muslim populations whose initial promises of toleration were gradually eroded through administrative pressure and legal restrictions. Christopher Columbus's voyage of discovery in 1492 opened unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion that would fundamentally transform Spain's position in European politics while providing new sources of wealth and strategic advantage. The Genoese navigator's proposals had been rejected by other European monarchs, but Isabella's willingness to support the expedition reflected both her personal religious convictions about spreading Christianity and practical calculations about the potential benefits of discovering new trade routes to Asia. The relatively modest investment required for the initial voyage made it an acceptable risk given the enormous potential rewards. The capitulations signed with Columbus established the legal framework for Spanish expansion into newly discovered territories while preserving royal sovereignty over any lands that might be found. The navigator's appointment as Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of any discovered territories provided him with substantial personal rewards, but ultimate authority remained with the Crown through its appointed representatives. These arrangements created precedents for colonial administration that would govern Spanish expansion throughout the following centuries. The discovery of inhabited lands in the Caribbean presented immediate challenges about the legal status and treatment of indigenous populations that had not been anticipated in the original agreements with Columbus. The monarch's instructions to their colonial representatives emphasized the importance of converting native peoples to Christianity, while establishing Spanish political authority over newly discovered territories. These policies reflected both genuine religious convictions about the obligation to spread Christian faith and practical considerations about creating stable foundations for colonial rule. The establishment of colonial administrative structures proceeded rapidly as the scope of Spanish discoveries expanded beyond the initial Caribbean settlements. The creation of the Casas de Contratación in Seville in 1503 provided institutional mechanisms for regulating colonial trade and supervising the appointment of colonial officials, while detailed legal codes addressed questions about land ownership, labour relations, and the treatment of indigenous populations. These administrative innovations created bureaucratic expertise that would prove crucial as Spanish territories expanded throughout the Americas. The economic impact of American discoveries became apparent within decades of the initial voyages, as precious metals from Caribbean mines and tribute payments from conquered territories provided new sources of royal revenue. The influx of gold and silver enabled the Spanish monarchs to pursue more ambitious European policies while supporting larger military forces than their territorial resources alone could have sustained. However, this American wealth also created new dependencies and economic distortions that would have profound consequences for Spanish development in subsequent centuries. The Italian wars that consumed much of the Catholic monarch's attention after 1494 reflected Spain's emergence as a major European power capable of challenging French hegemony in Italian affairs. Ferdinand's intervention in Italian politics was motivated by both dynastic claims to Neapolitan territories and strategic concerns about French expansion that might threaten Spanish interests in the Western Mediterranean. The military campaigns that followed demonstrated the effectiveness of Spanish military organisation while establishing precedents for sustained overseas operations that would characterise Spanish policy for generations. The great Captain Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba's innovations in military organisation and tactics revolutionised European warfare while establishing Spanish military supremacy that would persist throughout the 16th century. His development of combined arms formations that integrated pikemen, arquebusiers and cavalry created tactical systems that proved superior to traditional medieval military organisation. The battles of Cerignola and Garigliano in 1503 demonstrated these innovations' effectiveness while establishing Spanish control over the Kingdom of Naples. The diplomatic achievements of the Catholic monarch's reign included the negotiation of marriage alliances that connected the Spanish royal family with the major dynasties of Europe. The marriages of their children to Portuguese, Austrian and English royal houses reflected ambitious strategies designed to isolate France while creating networks of dynastic alliance that would support Spanish interests throughout Europe. These matrimonial policies would have profound consequences for European politics, ultimately leading to the concentration of unprecedented territorial holdings under Spanish rule. The deaths of Isabella in 1504 and Ferdinand in 1516 marked the end of the medieval period in Spanish history, while establishing the foundations for the early modern Spanish Empire. Isabella's testament emphasized the importance of maintaining religious orthodoxy and continuing the expansion of Christian territories, while Ferdinand's political arrangements ensured the succession of their grandson Charles, whose inheritance would include not only the Spanish kingdoms, but also the Austrian Habsburg territories and the Holy Roman Empire. This concentration of power would make Spain the dominant European power of the 16th century while creating new challenges that would test the institutional structures established during the Catholic monarch's reign. The transformation of medieval Spain into a unified monarchy capable of global expansion represented one of the most remarkable political achievements of the late medieval period. The institutional innovations, military developments, and administrative reforms implemented by Isabella and Ferdinand created the foundations for Spanish hegemony that would dominate European politics for the following century and a half. The conquest of Granada eliminated the last Islamic political presence in Western Europe, while the discovery of America opened new worlds for Spanish expansion and provided the resources necessary to sustain ambitious European policies. The establishment of religious uniformity through the Inquisition and the expulsion of unconverted populations created the ideological cohesion that would enable Spain to present itself as the champion of Catholic Christianity in its conflicts with Protestant and Islamic opponents. These achievements marked the definitive end of medieval fragmentation and the beginning of Spain's emergence as Europe's first global empire, transforming a collection of competing kingdoms into a unified state capable of projecting power across multiple continents while maintaining effective control over diverse populations and vast territorial holdings.